have an opportunity here to provide leadership, support, and a voice to the voiceless. The sacrifices that we made during our service do not end here. We carry on. We push forward, and we give hope and inspiration through love, community, and support. Stay free.
Rights and freedoms in this country are absolutely everything to me because I personally know the sacrifice required in order to get them back once they're gone. So when my brothers and sisters call Stand 2, be sure I'll be there.
Legacy media will play their games, right? Like, this isn't about this or that. This is about freedom, period.
The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Brothers and sisters in uniform, whether you're a police officer, military, check your hearts. Look where we're going. Man, wake up. I beg you.
If the veterans can't stand up and get a message across to the government, I don't know who can. I don't know. But we're going to give it our best shot. And I think we have a chance to win this and do it. But we need your help. And we need you to come, and we need you to stand too. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk again soon.
Have an opportunity here.
Woke pirates, yes they robbed, sold out to the merchant ships. Minutes after they took out from the bottomless pit, my head was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We forward in this generation triumphantly. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? It's all I ever have. Redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Oh, have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets? while we stand aside and look. Some say it's just a part of it. Got to fulfill the book. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? It's all I ever have. Redemption songs. Redemption songs. Redemption songs. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Oh, have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop the time. How long shall they kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. Got to fulfill the book. Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? It's all I ever have. Redemption songs. Redemption songs. It's all I ever have. Redemption songs. Redemption songs. Redemption songs.
Hey, what's up, troops? Jeff Evely, the Magnanimous GenX'er Male, back with you now on this 13th day of September 2024. It has been a minute. I have been an extremely busy guy, and I have this live stream scheduled with a friend of mine, Mark Snow from Veterans for Freedom, who wanted to come on and have a conversation about basically kind of the crux of what I'm getting at and a lot of the stuff. Yeah, we're going to have a little back and forth, and it was going to be fun, but I keep saying going to be because I think we got our times mixed up. So I just called him, and he is aware that I'm live right now, just waiting for him to enter the studio. But I think he was actually out at dinner at a restaurant somewhere. So he's probably going to be running behind. I'm not sure how long he's going to take because it looks like we lost the connection before I could get that far in the conversation. But this is the drawback of doing live shows, and I always seem to insist on doing live shows. It just cuts down a lot on the editing and stuff like that for me, so it just kind of facilitates stuff. It's not like I have a crew around here, right? Okay, so I am going to go ahead and say hello to everybody. I have missed you guys for a while. Man, oh man, it does seem like it's been a while. I haven't, but I've been all over the place. Okay, so Rob is saying good evening, afternoon to all patriots and bigots across Canada. And he gives us a maple leaf and a victory sign. What's up, Rob? It's good to have you on board, man. Evelyn says, hello, Jeff. Hello to you, Evelyn. James says, good evening. All. What's up, James? Rob is on Facebook as well. Says the same thing he said over on YouTube. And James is giving me the top cover and saying, smash that like button and share. Yes, please, everybody. It feeds the algorithm, or so I am told. Holly is saying, good evening, everyone. Cindy says, good evening, Jeff. Hello, friends. Hey, Cindy, I got my T-shirt on tonight. I just thought you might like to know. Yeah, I got a surprise in the mail from Cindy here. It's my very own T-shirt, and it says Magnanimous on the front of it here. So I thought that was so awesome. Thanks very much. It's perfect. Let's see. Okay. So Colleen says, good evening, folks. And Darlene is here saying, good evening, everyone. Hope all of you had a great weekend. And I think I'll jump over to Rubble. We got Dwayne over on Rubble saying evening all. So, all right. It's great to have everybody on board as always. And I'm going to go ahead and start diving into this thing. I'm going to have to kill some time, I think, to get our guest in here. I'll just give him a little. I'll give him a little bit of a head start here. I had a few things lined up, but as it says in the title, this is supposed to be a debate, so I didn't really line up any slides or anything like that. I just pulled up a few tabs kind of last minute in case I wanted to look at some references or pull something up, because we like to use visual aids around here, but not really any kind of delivery planned, or because it's a debate, so I'm not sure which direction it's going to go in. Anyway, hopefully he can make it, and I'll keep an eye on my messages. But while we're waiting, let's go ahead and do our philosophy meme for the day. So this is George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and I reference Hegel a bit when I'm talking about Marxism, and especially Marx's dialectical materialism, which he basically took Hegel's dialectic and weaponized it. So Hegel says, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. So we are doomed to continue repeating our mistakes if we do not learn from history. That's a big part of why I talk about what I talk about, because it's like, this is it. This is what causes history to continue cycling through these crisis eras of total war, civilizational collapse, and rebirth, if we're lucky. So if we're really going to do our duty here and stand on guard for thee, then I think we owe it to the future generations to figure out how it is that we're supposed to stop this. Otherwise, we're just going to end up destroying ourselves if we haven't already, with the whole jab deal there. Who knows if that could be an extinction event or not, but damn, we have a greater capacity every time one of these crisis eras rolls around to destroy ourselves. So we better figure this thing out quick, or that's what's going to happen. So anyway, that's Hegel. He says, we learn from history that we do not learn from history. Okay, and here is our meme for the day. So the topic for today's debate is the boomers must be stopped. Now, I am for the motion. I say they must be stopped, and Mark would like to correct me on that. So I'm interested to hear what he's going to say. I think I have some ideas, but anyway, I just have to wait and see if he's going to make it. Okay, so here is the meme. I didn't make this meme. This is something I pulled off of Twitter, and it's the meme of we got a soldier. He's clearly engaged in urban warfare. He's in some kind of a building and near a stairwell, and he's just throwing the grenade down the stairwell, and the soldier has the label boomers, and the grenade has the label voting Kamala as a final fuck you to their kids. I guess they really are coming out in force for Kamala. Oh my God. It's a hell of a scene down there. Okay. And James is saying boomers must be retired and stay silent. Well, thanks, James. I know you're going to be on my side. You guys are probably going to be on my side. Of course, we're gonna treat Mark with all his civility and politeness, as any of us would expect. Okay, and here's another one. I just thought to pull a few good jabs up here to kind of start us off. But this is Inverse Kramer over on X, not Jim Kramer. It says boomers, when they sell their houses for 100 times what they paid for them after doing absolutely no renovations. Yeah, that's what the size of it. And here they are. Okay, if you're just listening, they're line dancing, and my mother does line dancing, so it's just too entertaining for me. So after selling their homes for 100 times what they paid for them and doing no renovations, here they are out line dancing. Must be great being a boomer. Okay, and here is another one. Now the other generations are getting in on the action. Okay, I did not do this, so this was a pretty good one that I found on Twitter here. It's recent too, so here we go. Couple of guys pretending to be boomers. They're obviously millennials, though.
You hear a lot of millennials griping about how difficult it is to buy a home right now.
Yeah.
But what they don't realize is that real estate's all about finding the right time to buy, which in my instance was 30 years ago.
People always ask me, Bill, how'd you time the market so perfectly? And for me, I knew the exact time to buy was when I turned 27, just got married in 1990. I was working at the GM plant at the time, put down $18K on a $90K property. And that is now worth $600K.
And so instead of buying avocado toast, I went ahead and looked at the landscape and then was purposely born 30 years prior to that into a generation that had a much better wealth creation engine.
It's about timing your birth as much as it is about timing the market. You might have also noticed the price of college degrees going up at a time when more employers are requiring those college degrees, which is precisely the reason I chose to not be born in that era and carry that debt. But you'll notice,
And the employers who are demanding those degrees, by the way, are the boomers.
a lot of millennials are too lazy to do that, and they just end up being born when they're born.
That's a huge mistake.
Yep.
And look, you need to have the discipline to make sure that your generation encourages government policy to drive the prices up to increase your wealth while suppressing the wealth of the next generation.
And that is another thing that is talked about quite a bit in many of the books that I reference, especially Neil Howe's books like Generations and The Fourth Turning, and The Fourth Turning is here. And also Bruce Kennegibbney talks about this in The Generation of Sociopaths. It's that they are the essential electorate. Like everybody who wants to get elected has to bribe them to in order to get into office. So all the presidents tend to cater to the boomer demographic, to the detriment of all others.
That's another thing I use my market timing abilities to avoid being on the receiving end of. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a guy that made $500K on a single real estate deal. Haven't done it again since, one and done, retiring with the perfect record.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. I as well am batting 1,000 with the one primary residence I purchased.
And Colleen is just saying, don't forget white Christian males need not apply now. I think that I tend to attribute that to what Yuri Bezmenev talks about when he says the first stage of cultural subversion is that of demoralization of the young in schools, because he says that it's too late to stop the process of ideological subversion because the first stage, that of demoralization, has already taken place. And he says that those people graduated in the 60s. Who graduated in the 60s, right? So basically, yeah, demoralization is all about giving the kids these communist nudges in schools to make them hate their society and turn them against it. And what Yuri said in the interview with CBS News, I think it was, in 1984, was that those people had already graduated and they were actively participating in our institutions, working to turn them against us. And now they're at peak institutional power. And as you can see, they're all in a state of collapse and they're all working against us. So, let me see. Here's somebody who's not as agreeable, I guess. Mary Angel says they didn't have a better wealth creation engine. They had a wealth creation mentality. The Marxist mentality is limited pie, limited resource mentality. Actually, the Marxist mentality is the boomer mentality. That's kind of what I was just saying about the process of demoralization. I was working on some stuff. I just put out a video today for the 1 Million March for Children coming up, where I explain a lot of the history, the evolution of Marxism internationally and at home as well. And that's what we see is, like I just mentioned, the boomers graduated in the 60s after having been demoralized in the schools by the communists. And that was 1967, I believe it was, when German socialist by the name of Rudi Dutschke, West German it would have been, but Rudi Dutschke in West Germany called for the long march through the institutions. And then, the boomers with their degrees went back into the institutions. And that's another thing that is characteristically boomers. They don't work in high school and they're just going to stay in the institutions. Well, they might do a little bit of work in the summer, like planting trees and stuff like that. And that's enough to pay for the college degrees. And then they go back into the institutions and eventually become the professors. And as they become professors in the early 90s and the late 80s, we see people like Kimberly Crenshaw, there's Derek Bell with critical race theory. There's Judith Butler with gender as a social construct. I mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw with intersectionalism. Intersectionalism is a Marxist praxis. Like all of these disciplines, this critical theory and stuff like that really started coming to the fore as the boomers entered the professorships in the late 80s and early 90s. They're all Marxist praxis, essentially. They've co-opted academia and turned it, weaponized it against us, I guess, is what it is. So they're turning it into an indoctrination factory for the millennials. So people are always bagging on the millennials just about how, communist and woke and entitled there and everything. I'm like, how do you think they got that way? They got that way at the Boomerversity. So I don't blame the millennials like that. I feel like they're victims in all of this. Well, everybody is in a sense. The boomers weren't raised right, and that's why they are the way they are. So I could hardly blame them for it. But that's why I call them out, because I'm just like, you guys need to be aware. I know it's some of it is deeply evil, but most of it is sort of apathy, you know. So we got to kind of snap everybody out of their trances across the board right now. But Mark says he is rushing home. I was just texting while that one was going. And I think I'll just kind of keep this running, and I'll just blab at you guys for a little while we're waiting for Mark to jump into the studio. And I have another video lined up here. It's a good thing. I just put a few up like last minute while the music was playing. But, here is Neil Howe. So this is the guy that I reference the most. He's a demographer and an economist, and he forecasted that a major crisis would threaten our civilization in the year 2020, plus or minus 2 years, all the way back in 1991 when he published Generations with Bill Strauss as well. Bill Strauss was more like a master of literature, so he helped out a lot with the analysis of our stories, like going back over the myths and things like this. But I'll let Neil Howe talk about this. So it's a pretty good brief video. I didn't watch the whole thing. It's like 6:24. I think I'll just let it play, and it's a pretty good summation of the theory. Here we go.
Well, we've suggested in a book, both Generations and The Fourth Turning, that generations belong to archetypes, and these archetypes follow each other in the same order. A prophet archetype, like boomers, is always born after a crisis. They're always indulgently raised. They always think they're wonders at reshaping the culture. And when they enter their senior leadership years, they always take the country into a new outer world crisis. It's happened every time with that generation. American Revolution, Civil War, Great Depression, doesn't matter. The hero archetype is protectively raised and comes of age with a crisis. And then as they're entering old age, they're greeted with the next fiery upheaval of awakening from the young. That's also that archetype. Artist archetype is always the children of outer world crisis. The nomad is always the children of awakenings in American history. We see this pattern again and again, and it's linked to the fact that history itself has a pattern, and we call these turnings. You think about the basic architecture of this is as follows. The awakening is when we fix the inner world. I think I talked about that before. And the crisis is when we fix the outer world. And this circulation of turnings, we think, is an enduring feature of not only America, but many other modern societies as well. And we've written about this. What are these turnings? How would we describe the social mood? Well, a high is a post-crisis era, right? So there's a huge premium on keeping institutions strong, individualism suppressed. There's a great sense of public progress in these eras. They're actually very good economically, a point I'm going to return to in a second. Vernon Parrington, the American historian, calls these the great barbecues of American history. We just get around and just enjoy, how great we are collectively. We all recall, for instance, the American High, right? The awakening is a period when everyone tires of the social conformity. Everyone tires of all the social discipline. People want to find themselves again. We rebel against authority. We want more freedom for our own lives. And these movements are always fired by the young. And up until the 1960s, we always called these literally awakenings. The Puritan Awakening, the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. You see that as a sequence of events of fiery youth who challenge the institutions of older people. And of course, we remember the recent one, violent and ecstatic as it was. The unraveling is the third turning. Well, the unraveling takes the lessons of the recent awakening, right? Which is that you need to individuate, you need to atomize. That's how life is enjoyed. So institutions are weak and discredited. Individualism is strong and flourishing. Even today, you go into a bookstore, all the most upbeat books are about me, myself, and I. All the downbeat books are about what we share in common, the end of family, the end of society, whatever it is. Because we've been living through, a long period of unraveling. These are, when you think about decades that are big in the unraveling, you think of the 1990s, 1920s, 1850s, 1760s. These are all decades of cynicism and bad manners, a time when civic authority feels weak. People are pursuing their own interests. My favorite expression is that kind of Gen X slogan, "It works for me." I love that. It works for me. Okay. And of course, that's what we've had. But history teaches that unraveling eras always ultimately issue in crisis eras. And crisis eras is when suddenly our outer world institutions, economic, political, even legal, are torn down and rebuilt from the bottom up in a period when public history suddenly moves very quickly. And it's usually done so under what perceived to be urgent threats to the very survival of the nation or the economy. And if a crisis doesn't emerge spontaneously, forth-turning leaders, which are the boomer archetype, the prophet archetype, will actually produce one just to make it happen. Because to rally common sacrifice. The culture is redefined in terms of community or even propaganda. And individuals refine themselves as part of greater collective units. And each of these eras in American history has come to be regarded as almost a new founding moment, constitutionally, politically, economically in our history. We think that that's what we can expect over the next 15 years or 14 or 13 years we have left in the fourth term. We expect history to speed up, public history to speed up in that way. I had to go with what's in the headlines. We think these are linked to broader movements that many historians have observed. The long war cycle by Arnold Toynbee, there's much writing on cycles of religious awakening. Realigning elections, Schlesinger and Walter Dean Burnham. A foreign policy by Klink. Many people have written about these cycles. What we try to do is bring it together and give a constant governor and explanation, which is generational aging. Now, let me just review, and this is going to conclude this, and then see what questions you have. But these are the kinds of things we shift. Social priorities will go from third to fourth turning, maximum individualism to rising community. Government will be strengthening. In fact, every period of crisis in American history requires the strengthening of government. Party politics, we're entering a new period of realignment. God, this year, you just see it. We may have both parties simultaneously realigning this year. Foreign policy, what Klingberg calls a crisis introversion, a new period of isolationism, not wanting to intervene, but of course that could explode outward as it did from the 1930s into World War II. Technology, we go from experimentation to taking to scale. Income equality will be rising. This is going to put another pressure on earnings, by the way, if you're following corporate balance sheets, and rising real wages and productivity, disruption, and reset.
Click on the link in the description below to receive a transcript of Neil Howe's full speech.
Wow, I don't expect that you guys are going to do that. But anyway, yeah, that's Neil Howe. That's a pretty condensed version of 3 books that he's published. Every one of them is really something to chew on, too. Very data rich, a lot of history, and they delve into even myths and things like that, where we see the same archetypes recurring again and again. So I mean, I think I recommend these books like every show. So by all means, folks, go out and check them out. If you don't believe me, or maybe you want to delve into it a little bit more so you can kind of understand the minutia and whatnot, then I would highly recommend those books if you want to understand the current crisis. Okay, so having said all of that, that's enough stalling for now. It looks like Mark has made it into his studio, and so we'll go ahead and bring him in there. Did you shit the bed, Mark?
I did, and I deserve such a trouncing and a good dressing down, and I do profusely apologize, Jeff, because I got the EST wrong, and I'm sitting out paying for my meal, and my wife gets your phone call, and who the hell is this guy? I just said, we got to get going. I'm going on at 7, so please forgive me. I am a dork for missing this, and I do apologize.
Yeah, it's okay. It happens to everybody, especially with the different time zones and stuff. I always put my stuff in like Eastern time, just because it seems to be, where the population is. So anyway, it's it happens more often than we like to admit. So it's all good. Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into it, and maybe a little bit about what brought you here today?
A little bit of that, because you keep trashing boomers, and I really want to have a talk about that. I admire and respect you and everything you've done in Veterans for Freedoms. You and I both were arrested up on Parliament Hill. We understand what duty, honor, and discipline is. I'm not a conservative, a liberal, NDP, or Green Party. I left all that and joined the Libertarian Party because, well, what we're going to talk about is not libertarian politics, about what went wrong to get us to the point where you are saying boomers are at fault. And I don't disagree with you on a lot of areas, but I disagree with you fundamentally on how we got there. That guy there that was just on that video as I was waiting, 11 minutes from Kempville to Oxford Mills. That's a new record. Let's leave it at that. But exactly what he was talking about is what we need to talk about to try to not to take the blame off the boomers, because they're the legislative body that created it. I did 30 years as infantry, RCR, lineman, released medically in 2011, became a public servant. And when I was up participating in the Freedom Convoy, they came after me like there was no tomorrow. And I just said, pound salt, I'm out of here. And I beat them on everything that they tried to throw at me through the public service commissions. I beat them on everything. So
nice. Well
done. Yeah, that's where I'm at. I'm a farmer now.
Oh, awesome. That sounds peaceful. I just went to visit Drew on the farm there recently. It was my first time there. So anyway, I do envy the more quiet lifestyle. And not that I'm in a big city or anything like that. I just, I'm in the suburbs, so I have neighbors and stuff. And anyway, there are some days I'd rather just be out in the country. Okay, so all right, I'll see if I can kind of give the proper context here. This is the video that kind of got this engaged. So it's 53 seconds long. I'll just show it really quick here. The quote at the top says, "Boomers, you have it so much easier in today's world. Just work harder." And here is the video. Oh, I got some sound on that.
Hello. Hey now, you're an all-star. Get your game on, go play. Hey now, you're a rock star. Get the show on, get paid. Only shooting stars break the mold. It's a cool place, and they say it gets colder. You're bundled up now, wait till you get older. But the media man begs to differ, judging by the hole in the satellite picture. The ice we skate is getting pretty thin. The water's getting warm, so you might as well swim. My world's on fire, how about yours? That's the way I like it, and I'll never get bored. Hey now, you're an all-star. Get your game on, go play. Hey now, you're a rock star. Get the show on, get paid. All that glitters is gold.
Okay, so if you're just listening, what we're seeing here, there's a graph and an animation where the graph is kind of being drawn as we see it. It's pretty good. It's the blue line here is household income, and it is not much higher than it was even in 1985. It went, let's see, at 1985, we're at 0% on the y-axis, and it made it all the way up to maybe 37% on the y-axis, whereas the price of rent right around the same time is at about 160%. So they were both together at zero when we started in 1985. But once we get out here to right about where we are now, the peak here for the rent price looks like that's probably 2020, 2021, something like that. 160% what it was, whereas wages have only increased about 37%. So that's a massive delta between the price of rent and the average household income. And I think that has a lot to do with why the younger generations are having such a hard time getting started. But all right, Mark, why don't you just go ahead and give us your take on that? Because I think this.
So I really took offense to this and the word of boomers, and nothing you're showing here is wrong. You're absolutely right in the statistical graphical representation of what you showed. That is correct. But there's two things that are missing from the, and I think that the impetuous child is the word that I used in regards to the blaming of the boomers. And you're right, the boomers, the current generation of politics, created this mess that we're in. But it doesn't begin in 1985. It began in 1972. And what happened is Pierre Elliott Trudeau took us off the gold standard. And I'm sure you're familiar with fiat banking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a result of that, inflation is a planned tool. It's a planned tool that is designed to go in cycles. And I'm trying to really can it down into a nutshell. The government works with the banks to create cheap money, just like this last cycle, 2019 through to 2022. They create cheap money. They get a whole bunch of people into mortgages. And then they create so much money that massive amounts of buying. And you can look at the cycles, the mid 1980s, the mid 1990s, the mid 2000s, the 2013s, where this 15-year cycle goes, and the house prices double, mortgage rates go down, and then they squeeze people for the next 50 years. Governments need this. They plan it. They work actively with the banks to do it. And the reason being is because it's not necessarily they don't care about the house prices, but what happens is when you think of taxation, there hasn't been a general tax increase in provincial or federal government. Oh yeah, I was duck hunting this morning. People were calling the police. The reason they don't care about, or the reason why they design inflation is so that they can actually. Oh my God, this is going to drive me nuts the whole night with all those pop-ups.
You don't have to read them. I just try to participate a little bit while you're talking.
So they design inflation because there hasn't been a general increase in taxation other than carbon taxes and sales taxes and stuff like that. But we used to have elections about tax increases to fund the government. Each one of these cycles of this business cycle, 15 years of expensive money, 5 years of cheap money, traps another, in this case, 5.2 million people between 2019 and 2022, when interest rates actually collapsed the market. And you see that there, right? You've seen that in the tail end of that graph. But what happens is that in so creating this inflation and excess money, which creates a shortage of goods, which causes increases in prices. When you used to get a bag of Ruffles chips, 2 bags for $5, the government here in Ontario would collect $5 times 13 cents. Now those 2 bags are $10. And it is now, instead of collecting 13 cents per dollar, they're on $5, they're collecting $1.30 worth of tax on $10. They need and design inflation to work so that it doubles the government's revenue coming in. In Ontario here, we're getting $16.20 pay raise from $15.50. And as a result of that, Walmart and every other employer out there is going to raise their cost of goods to be able to service that. And it works for the first bit for people. And then inflation, because of the price increases of labor, pushes up the cost of the goods again. And the only people that win at the end of the day is the government with more taxation. What used to cost now $5 is now $6.
Yeah, so I understand how inflation works, but the thing is that this graph doesn't show just signs of inflation here. Like inflation would not explain the delta, and that's really what this graph is intended to show, is just the increasing delta between household income and the price of rent. So the household income portion of it, I mean, yeah, that does, because the inflation really only relates to the value of your dollar, the purchasing power of your dollar. So
actually, the devaluation of your dollar when it comes to inflation.
Yeah, I know, but the devaluation of the purchasing power. So this doesn't show inflation; it shows household income, and really, we should expect to see household income increase steadily along with inflation, but that's not what they see. That's not what we see. And the other thing is that inflation relates to the currency, not the price of rent. So, or not the delta between the price of rent and household income. So inflation would not explain that.
So before we get into the household income, we'll go back to your chart and the rise in that. You have to understand that rent price and home price are 2 separate items. I have friends that bought multiple units when the money was cheap, and now are losing those units because they knew they could rent them out because the price was going up and they had built-in equity, all by design in regards to the government fiscal policy with the Bank of Canada to allow people to overextend themselves. I've seen it 3 times in my life. I'm 61 years old. I've seen it happen in the 80s where people's house values doubled from the 70s to the 80s to the 90s. And that rent price is reflective of the influx of money and cheap money in regards to the cost of servicing each one of those mortgages. They know that 10% of those 5.2 million mortgages, 520,000 mortgages, will default in the next 5 years. This is part of the business cycle. They don't care. But when you get into one of these places and you've planned it out at 2.5% interest over 5 years on a 20-year mortgage, your payment works out to be, I don't know, $2,100 a month, say. And then they rent the place out for $2,800 a month. But when the interest rates go up, I just lost my train of thought. They plan that out that way.
Yeah,
and
they would go, if the interest rates go up, then
homes,
their payments would go up, and so would
Yeah.
the rent would go up.
So
Yes.
the red line is explained only through fiscal policy that pushes that price artificially up. Because here's an example. In the 1980s, interest rates were 18%. I bought my first house in Chalk River when I was in Petawawa in 1986. Interest rates were, I think it was 15.5%, but the house was only $35,000. Now you term that out over 25 years, right? Or over a 20-year mortgage, and the mortgage payment, I think, was $247 a month. Now take that same house sold last year for $725, or 2 years ago for $725,000, and the interest rates were 0.25% or 2.25%. So if you look at the bank's cycle of money that they actually earn over that 20-year period of a mortgage, it's the same amount of payout relationship to the amount of interest that was charged, 15% versus 2.5%, $34,000 versus $700,000. And that's the relationship. And why do we have that relationship? In that rent price, the total value of the monetary policy that ties up and increases artificially the price of housing is the reason for the rent spiking, because they've done it in these cycles. And it's only been since 1972, which, like I said, your chart ends in 1985.
Yeah, I mean, it starts there, yeah.
Yeah, but it starts in 1972 when the government started playing with artificial fiat money instead of gold-backed standards. We could only spend more than 10% of what our actual gold holdings were. That kept the government in check. And when they did this, they were able to create money out of thin air, which is what they do right now. And then the banks and the government needed to be able to produce inflation. The Bank Canada tries to do with 2% GDP, right? Or 2% inflation per year. That's considered normal. Well, 2% a year on a $1.3 trillion economy is a lot of revenue for the government in the form of sales tax, carbon taxes, and GST. And they need that to not go back to the policies of saying, we want to run an election and we're going to have a 3% general tax increase. This is what it was that was created through the new charter and constitution that allowed the government to be able to do this monetary policy in conjunction with the banks to allow natural inflation to increase taxation so that the government continues receiving pre-planned and pre-programmed revenue without having to go to the
yeah, I mean, that explains inflation, but we're not even really showing inflation on this graph is the thing. Like, that's kind of what I keep going back to is
but it's
trying
all
to illustrate
relative
is that,
to that path going up,
costs
monetary
have
policy.
completely. Yeah, but if that were the case, then we would expect to see we wouldn't expect to see this delta, right? Because inflation would also mean that wages would go up. Right? Wages would go up along with costs. So because that's how inflation works. So,
right, and I agree with you.
That's not what we see here. We see this delta. So there's this massive delta between costs and earnings. And that's what this graph, I think, is intended to show. That wasn't there before. And if it were attributable to inflation alone, I don't think that it really is a factor. But if it were attributable to inflation alone, then we would expect to see each one of these lines basically tracking one another because wages would keep pace with costs.
And I don't disagree with anything that you say there. The secondary aspect to that is wages. Let's talk about the blue line where you say household income. It's not that difficult to figure out why household income hasn't gone up. Our general revenues, when I started out before I joined the Army in 1981, I was making $2.15 an hour as a pin setter in D&A Bowling Alley in Trenton, Ontario. My first paycheck in the Army in June of 1981 was $212.58. I still have my journal, and I thought I was the richest man in the world. In 1972, taxation on all forms of provincial, federal, municipal government was 17 cents on the dollar. Today, and if you look over through 1999, you'll look and see that is closer to 54% of every dollar that we earn. So household income has gone up. If you start a job tomorrow, you're going to be making $16.20 versus the $2.15 an hour that I was making when I was a pin setter. But I'm not able to keep as much money as I used to be able to keep because the government on all levels is sucking away 54% of every dollar that I earn.
Right. So, and one other thing I want to point out is that the note on the bottom of this graph says rent and income are inflation adjusted. So it's not inflation that's causing this delta. There's not if it's inflation adjusted. So,
and again, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm trying to explain the fundamental difference between the red line and the blue line, and that's where I come back. And we'll even get to the boomer statements that you say that it's not necessarily the boomers that are doing it, even though they're the age group that's in charge of the country right now, and have been for the last 40 years, right? They don't care. I don't disagree with you, but that's not the reason. The reason is for not. But household income.
I would say that I think you're confusing proximate and ultimate causes, and when you're discussing these monetary policies and public policy more broadly, and government. When you say government, it's those are proximate causes, and what I'm trying to hit on here are the ultimate causes. So it's a little bit like saying guns shoot people to say that government is doing this. Government and public policy are basically the tools, and whether those tools are used to do good or evil really depends on who is wielding them. So yeah, I think that's we're kind of talking past each other right now because you're talking about what is being done, and I am talking about who is doing it, and I'm putting this within the framework of the cycle of history in accordance with Strauss-Howe generational theory to show that what changed is boomer ascendancy. So the higher the boomers get in terms of societal power, the worse it gets for the rest of us. And this is, of course, I'm referencing 4 different books on this one. It's all 3 in Neil Howe's books, as well as Bruce Cannon-Gibney's Generation of Sociopaths, How the Boomers Betrayed America. And yeah, this is the basic idea. It's essentially that when the boomers were buyers and wage earners, wages were high and prices were low. But as they move up and accrue wealth and become the investors, especially through the 90s, we start to see these deltas kind of take off. And in 2008, like they're showing the global financial collapse here around 2008. That's this little drop here that you see. It's actually a massive drop, but on this graph, it just looks like this little blip here. So there's the global financial collapse. That was, according to Neil Howe, the institutional crisis. The financial markets were the first institution to go into crisis, and then the rest of them basically fall like dominoes. So the fourth turning is catalyzed with the minor crisis. That minor crisis was the global financial collapse, and then all throughout the 2010s, we saw, like, say, the G20 summit in 2010, where police kettled protesters. So the police became corrupt. They started becoming really heavy-handed and militarized as the boomers reached peak institutional power in the police forces, and as they became the deans and the tenured professors as well in the 2010s. That's when we started seeing things like professors showing up at these student demonstrations and saying we need to muscle over here to get rid of these journalists, and the Weinsteins, getting run out of the university because all the students have been radicalized, and so on and so forth. So it's like I said, it's a difference between proximate and ultimate causes. Like guns don't really shoot people. It really depends, on who's using them and how they are used. So that's the argument that I'm making. Really, I'm discussing the ultimate causes, and what changed is, like, there's a new sheriff in town, and that's the boomer generation. Demographically, it's been the same really since the days we were hunter-gatherers, where elders kind of, they stay back at the fire. They decide what the mission is going to be for the day. They set the tone and direction for the mission, the hunt, the war party. The younger generation, like, they do the hunting and they fight the wars, and the midlife generation are the ones who lead the hunt and lead the war parties. And it's analogous to, like, Canadian Armed Forces doctrine, CAF leadership doctrine, where they talk about the leading institutions and leading people. So there are the people who work within the institutions. There are those who lead those people, and then there are those who lead the institutions. And just due to natural attrition, the generational breakdown tends to be that young people are the ones who work and fight the wars, and the midlifers are the middle managers, the people leading people, and then the elders are the people leading institutions. And so the institutions are led by boomers right now, and we can see what happened with the Canadian Armed Forces under their stewardship, and that's what's been going on in the Canadian Armed Forces since they reached peak institutional power in the early 90s. Especially with the Somalia affair and the scandal plague mess ever since, has been like since the boomers came into the chief of defense staff position. And so that's where the rest of the institutions are headed, is where the Canadian Armed Forces is right now.
Yeah, and I still take. I learned some new terminology today in regards to your two categorizations, and I was sitting there thinking, "What the hell is he talking about? I've never even heard these two words before." But what really needs to be replaced, Jeff, and I spent a lot of years looking around, trying to figure out what was wrong with the system, and what you're really looking to replace is we're looking for an evil character in this. And in this case, we've labeled them the boomers. A lot of people label the millennials as lazy people, right? That may stick, but boomers in the terminology and the outcomes of what you're seeing and the use of boomers, I think is what offends me the most, even though I'm at the tail end of the boomer. And I have no problem. Offend me all you like. We got tough skin. You could yell at me and call me every name in the book, and I ain't going to care. I apologize profusely for being an idiot and missing this. I'd be up for you if this was the case in our old days.
Sorry.
But it's not boomers, Jeff. It's the government. And this is the point that I want to
get. But who's the government? Who runs the government? Who runs the public service? I mean, it's Janice Charette, who is right at the center of the Emergency Measures Act invocation. It's Jody Thomas, who I think was probably the driving force behind the Emergency Measures Act invocation, and she's also the one that got all the generals fired so they could get the guy who would impose the vaccine mandate in there. There's Tiff Macklem. Like, if you want to talk about monetary policy, the head of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, was the guy, boomer, who said that his monetary policy, like going into the pandemic, he said that it would not cause inflation. He could say flippantly that it was not going to drive inflation. And Pierre Poilievre, Gen X'er, told him that yes, it would. And sure enough, we've got an inflation crisis.
Boomer would have told him the same thing.
Yeah, that's right.
He did the exact same thing by doing inflationary spending $60 billion a year over what we were bringing in. Again, I come back to it. It's the government on all levels. And I've really taken a good hard look at it. I thought maybe there was bad players, and it's not that there's bad players. And what happened, Jeff, was in 1982, the new Constitution and the Charter came out. And this is where all of this
let me ask you this.
And abuse of authority has derived from. Because prior to that, these politicians didn't have the ability to be able to make legislative changes that they were doing prior to the new Constitution and Charter that granted them all of these words reasonable. Reasonable appears in the Criminal Code 211 times. Prior to that, under the old Criminal Code, it never appeared.
Right. So the problem that I see with that, though, is that they're not the same people anymore. You're talking about the government as if it's this constant, but it's not. It's just a concept that we apply to positions, jobs, a group of jobs that are funded with tax dollars. And it's so the people who filled those jobs in 1972 or in 1982, they're not there anymore. It's it's not the same people in those managerial positions.
What exists post 1984, when everything was finally settled, was a new round of authorities that allowed the state to do a whole bunch more things that it was not allowed to do under the 1933 Westminster, the 1867 Constitution, and the 1967 Bill of Rights. So under those three documents, those did not allow the government to extend power to affect the people in the way that it did. It did not allow the government to overspend. It didn't. Before that, you couldn't do that. And Mulroney and Trudeau knew this. It was only Ed Broadbent of the NDP who was advocating for change to retain some of the things that kept Canada as a free and independent nation with accountability. And I'm no NDPer, but those are when you go back and read the historical record, that's exactly what was going on. Ed Broadbent was trying to convince Mulroney and Trudeau Sr., criminal defense lawyers who lost many capital cases over the Charter and the Constitution, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And from that, whatever boomers were there or whatever people have been there since, Harper, Polyev was under Harper. They have continued to grow their ability to do all of the things that you're talking about legally without any kind of checks and balances in place. And
yeah. So how do those changes to Canadian public policy create a global crisis, the likes of which we're in now?
Well, that's another whole podcast in regards to fiat banking and how the markets manipulate people into not the Warren Buffetts of the world who are able to make $1 million in one transaction and keep it for a day and sell it and make $2 million. But the average person, the 2008 stock market collapse, the 2014 collapse, slightly as we've seen in that document, were all designed and planned to liquidate the market and cash out that capital before they had to pay it out to people. My mother-in-law.
That's what happens. That's something that happens with every generation. Well, I think that's just part of a natural part of the cycle. Like when people cash out their assets before they retire, and that's what causes the boom and bust cycle. That's what Neil Howe explains with Strauss-Howe generational theory. So there's always like a boom as a generation accrues wealth and moves upward, and like there's a lot of investment taking place and stuff like that. But as the torch is passed from one generation to the next, where one is retiring and cashing out, the next one has to kind of come in and scoop it all up. So that's kind of what causes the bust. And the big bust is the fourth turning. Every time you get this generational changeover at peak institutional power, it's called the turning, and the fourth one is always the biggest one. So that's where we are right now. It's going to be the fourth bust since the last one. So the previous fourth turning would have been catalyzed with the 29 stock collapse. Ours was catalyzed with the 2008 stock collapse, and that one, the fourth one, is the major depression one. And just like Milton Friedman said, that all major depressions in history were caused by the wealthy scooping up all the resources from the lower class. Now, he's thinking strictly in economic terms. He's not applying that demographic or generational lens. But the fact of the matter is that the rich tend to be older people, because people they accrue wealth throughout their entire lifetimes. It takes a while to become rich. So the wealthiest people tend to be the oldest people. And what happens in the fourth turning is that the generation that was born in the wake of the previous crisis, that's the one who was always raised as indulged. And that's what results in the widespread antisocial personality disorder that Bruce Gibney discusses in his book, A Generation of Sociopaths. This is a Globe and Mail article. They covered him in 2017 when that came out. And so, it's that generation that's born in the wake of the previous crisis. In this case, that would be the boomers in World War II. When they reach peak institutional power in their early elderhood, they abuse their economic superiority in order to destroy the wealth of all the younger generations and hoover it all up for themselves. So that's why you get major depression.
I really cannot believe a single word of that headline, and it is so easily torn apart if you put it back up.
That one? How so?
Yeah. A generation of sociopaths. Yeah. That might be. Scroll back up to the top. Just let's analyze the headline. How boomers mortgage the future.
That's what they've been saying for years, though. We're mortgaging our children's future. I've been hearing that my whole life.
Okay, so there's a difference how they mortgage the future. Now, there's mortgage as we're speaking of homes, and then there's mortgaging as in the national debt, right? So when we say that we've mortgaged our children's future, that is the national debt that we're talking about. And every government, when Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the leader of the Liberal Party Canada, I think it was $4 billion in debt. Every prime minister and every government, whether it be a fiscally conservative or socially liberal government, has increased that debt exponentially, from Trudeau Sr. to Mulroney to Chrétien to Martin to Harper and now to Trudeau. And next it's going to be handed off to Pierre Poilievre, most likely. And when Harper gave up the government and lost in 2016, he left a legacy of $646 billion. And when he left that legacy, Trudeau in the 7 years since has tripled it or doubled it to 1.2 to almost $1.3 billion. We went from paying $1.8 billion a month in interest. That's another question. Who do we pay interest to paying almost $2.2 billion a month in interest. Each prime minister since 1972, since we went off the gold standard, has done exactly what that says, mortgage the future of our children. And as a direct result of mortgaging and debt creation, taxation policy from the 80s, whether it be the whether it be acid rain, whether it be carbon monoxide and smog in the cities, catalytic converters, every one of those scares of climate has increased and created the need for more taxation. Carbon tax is just the latest scam because the government needs the revenue to service that mortgage debt of the future. And if that's what you're talking about, you're absolutely right. But it needs to be explained to people in a way that they need to understand that every time the government spends $1 over the budget, they got to increase the revenue model, taxation, to be able to do that. It is by far the most damaging thing that we are doing to our children is not paying down that debt. And I just, I was in an interview today because I'm running in the Quinte by-election, and someone said to me, I asked the reporter, I said, do you know what Ontario's debt is? No. Well, it's $313 billion. It's been increased $12 billion. I said, if I took $40 billion from our $260 billion Ontario budget, and it would take me 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is true, but it still doesn't explain why we're in a global crisis. Like these are Canadian economic policies. So we have a crisis that's engulfed the entire world at this point. And we're on the brink of World War III, just like Neil Howe said we were going to be back in 1991.
You and I know what's coming.
Yeah, I know what's coming.
Yeah. So we all know what's coming in the sense of the total collapse. And it's been a design collapse, Jeff. You know that. You know as well as I do, this is a design collapse to steal the wealth of everybody, not just boomers. It's designed to take your pensions. It's designed to take everything so that we become a democratic socialist state, a communist state, or what do they call that? Socialism. Socialism with democracy. Jesus,
social democracy.
Yeah, social democracy.
I think we're going further than that, but
yeah. Well, the idea is to collapse it, steal everybody's wealth, and use it to wipe out the debt. That's
what I was.
Communism works.
Yeah, and that was what I was just talking about with the Milton Friedman quote there, where he pointed out that the major depressions, the big ones, every 4 generations are the ones where the wealthy are actually stealing from the poor, and that only happens every 4 generations when the generation born in the wake of the previous crisis.
Now I understand what you're talking about in that.
Yeah, so you're talking
the Overton window for that 4th generation. There's that tipping point.
Yeah. So again, I'll throw back to the proximate and ultimate causes. Like guns don't shoot people, people shoot people. So, it really depends on how the tool is wielded. And what we see here, this is an article from Fortune magazine, and the title is "Older Boomers Won the Pandemic After Becoming a Whopping $14 trillion Richer. Fed Data Reveals, and Gen X is Losing the Race." So I didn't realize we were in a race since, we were born like 25 years behind you guys. Like you guys had a pretty big head start there. But that's essentially what happened is we saw public policy that crushed the small business sector. Like take Adamson's Barbecue, for example. Like they brought out the horses, so you couldn't buy your barbecue at Adamson's, but you could go right down the street to Costco. And so everything kind of transferred from the small business sector. It got hoovered up into the corporations like Amazon. The thing is that, again, because of the way wealth is distributed across a society and power is distributed demographically across generations due to natural attrition, the way this works is that the senior investment class they tend to be the older generation, and the midlife generation tend to be the ones who have successful small businesses and are perhaps on the verge of starting franchises, like perhaps Adamson's might have been. And that was all destroyed by the public policy that was implemented by, public health officers like, for example, Robert Strang, who in Nova Scotia here, who is a boomer, and the Bonnie Henrys and so on and so forth. So it's the institutional power that is, kind of the behind the scenes power, the hidden hand, as it were. Well, I mean, maybe that's more like the Chinese, but yeah. And what Trudeau is always saying is we're following the advice of the professional public service. That's the opposite of what a politician is supposed to do. But I don't believe for one second that he's the mastermind that's orchestrating all this. The guy's just a duplicitous Ken doll, marionette on a stage in the Kabuki Theater. So we're not after the marionettes here. We're after the shadowy figures in the background that are controlling the marionettes. And according to these authors, that is the boomers.
So first of all, again, don't take that down. Analyze. Fortune is not known as a actual centrist newspaper. And when we actually look at the propaganda of the statement that's wrote here on this page, older boomers won the pandemic after becoming a whopping $14 trillion richer. No, I didn't become $14 million richer or $14 trillion richer.
It doesn't mean every boomer. It's a general
Right.
statement. It's
But
not a blanket
the enemy
statement.
in this left-leaning article is the boomers. That's who they're calling. That is part of the government's narrative to disenfranchise us and take from the wealthiest group, as you say, right? After becoming, you tell me where in the US there's 330 million, 320 million people and 15 million people in Canada, how we came up with $14 trillion when we haven't even reached 1 billion people in North America yet. So you think of that. Now, in my case.
But it says Federal Reserve data.
Yeah,
That's the title.
It's irrelevant. I'm
the
trying
data is
to point out
relevant.
the difference between the headline and the 14 trillion. Older boomers won the pandemic after becoming a whopping $14 trillion richer. No, we didn't. The super wealthiest, the Warren Buffetts, the stock market super players, the State Street, the BlackRock, the Vanguard, they became $14 trillion richer.
Yeah, like BlackRock, that's run by Larry Fink, who's a boomer,
Yeah,
and he
sure.
says he wants to
They're
force
the
behavior.
guys that got rich. It wasn't us.
The
Now,
boomers.
Yeah,
they're boomers.
They are boomers. They wouldn't exist without the authority to do so. They wouldn't exist without the tax rules in place to be able to do that.
Yeah.
This is what the problem is. Government is a problem. But
yeah, and who's running the government? It's the boomers.
The government is running
they're
itself
running institutions
through legislation that protects them from prosecution.
But the government is not sort of its own thing. It's just a concept that we apply to these different positions that are taxpayer funded. It's a matter of who's filling those positions. So
right.
The people filling the people filling the senior leadership positions within the institution are the boomers.
There's the boomers, which is the average guy like me who made a couple $100,000 selling his house in 2020. Right? I made a couple $100,000. I didn't make trillions of dollars. It is the state-backed laws, both state meaning the government, either in the US or Canada, that has allowed these Larry Finks and all these other people to profit off that and have the ability to buy up houses and further increase the house prices. Instead of individuals, we got companies buying houses, sitting them empty.
Yeah, and who runs the companies?
Yeah.
And what happened with the global financial collapse, because I think that kind of ties into what we're talking about here, is that Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act of 1939, which was put in place to create another collapse, the likes of which happened in 1935, the likes of which happened in 1929. So they put that legislation in place to segregate the bond market from the mortgage market in order to protect people from such a collapse. And then when the boomers came into the presidency, Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act so that the boomers who were entering the investment class at that time during their midlives and would have been sort of the senior mortgage brokers around that time, or established mortgage brokers. The bondsmen started going in and buying up all these mortgages, because when you buy these mortgages up into a bond, theoretically the yield goes up, but the risk stays the same. That's right. And the bondsmen who were selling these mortgages started writing about a bunch of bad mortgages, because they knew that they'd never be accountable for it if a bondsman was just going to come up and buy it the next day. So they wrote a ton of bad mortgages. Those were individuals who made those decisions, knowing very well that it was going to cause harm. And as they defrauded their way to the peak institutional power in the markets, when they reached the top, there was nothing but bubble underneath them. And so the whole thing completely fell down. And then they became the first generation to say that we're too big to fail. Nobody. And who were they, though? They were the boomers, and it was Obama who said they were too big to fail, and they gave them a bunch of money from all the other generations to keep them afloat, and they paid themselves bonuses and laid off all the younger generations working in the trades.
Again, a government so big that it can provide all of your needs is also big enough to take everything you own. And again, whether it be Trump on stage with Hillary saying that, Trump, why don't you show us your tax return? And he goes, because I do the same things that your donors do. When the rules are such that they keep granting themselves immunity from any kind of prosecution, this is where we're at. And until nothing's going to change in Canada, I'm telling you right now, nothing's going to change until we hit what you're calling your fourth.
The first turning. It goes back to the first turning after this, when Gen X displaces the boomers from peak institutional power.
Right. So until we hit that collapse, nothing's going to change institutionally, governmentally.
I agree.
I'm kind of hoping that, a PPC or a libertarian or some form of grassroots freedom convoy type party takes root and says, we got to stop this. We got to stop giving all these privilege and power to all these special interest groups and write these rules, and everybody's got to pay their fair share. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they don't do that. They don't do that. It is.
I think that's the complaint that the younger generations have, is that they really have to pay a lot more over the course of their lifetime than the boomers do. And I just wanted to point.
I pay the same amount of gas for everybody else. I pay the same taxes.
Not at the same stage as your life. No, not at the same stage as of your life. Like, I mean, I came on the scene and taxes were higher, income tax, not just income tax, but they brought in the GST and HST and stuff like that. I've never known a period where gas was cheap and muscle cars were available, and there was no GST or HST or any of that. So it's a matter of getting the biggest leg up in history and then not paying it forward.
Let me interrupt you for that.
Well, I want to point out one thing on this before you do. The thing about pointing out that this is Fortune magazine is ultimately an ad hominem. So it's a logical fallacy. It's not a question of who says it that makes it true or false. It's a question of whether the argument is valid and it's supported by evidence, and they are going by Federal Reserve data. So, if there was a problem with the way that they compiled it here somewhere that we were able to identify, then
I can't read the article to do that. But I mean, just by saying, you say it's an ad hominem attack. If I replace the word, government wrote the rules that allowed multimillionaires and boomers to profit a whopping $14 trillion based on government permissions. That's what it is. And this is where I keep coming back to, is that if you knew how to do something better because you had an inside line, and we're talking like the major corporations. We're not talking average guys like me and you, right?
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
But you're right. Institutionally, the time of the boomers is here. But those boomers would not be able to do what they did without the authority, the tax code, with the protections, instead of being accountable.
It kind of seems like they did a lot of stuff that they weren't allowed to do anyway, and just kind of looted the public coffers. There's the whole
since 1972.
No, since the pandemic, because like you said, there was a surplus when Harper left office. So, and I think that also is a problem for that reasoning as well, because somebody was able to produce a surplus under those conditions using that system. Like the system is just the tool. It's a question of who's wielding it. And that's the difference between your proximate and your ultimate causes. And the other thing that I want to point out too is what's discussed in A Generation of Sociopaths, as well as all of Neil Howe's books on generations and the fourth turning and whatnot, is that the boomers have been the essential electorate since they entered voting age, especially since around the early 80s and the Reagan era. So every politician has had to appeal to the boomers in order to get into office. And what they tend to vote for is they vote for policies that are going to benefit them.
Not true.
Yeah, that's what that is true. That's in all of those. Yes, it's in all of those books. That is absolutely true. It's in all of those books.
I'm telling you this. I'll debate any one of those authors on this, on the simple premise of this. With the rise of the new Constitution and Charter and the ability for government to be able to...
Who was the essential demographic? Who was the essential electorate in 1982 when the
the
boomers.
Constitution...
Right.
The boomers and my generation, the 25-year-olds, I guess you could say. But what I really need you to understand is that since the 80s, the last election that we had that was based on policy was between Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Brian Mulroney. That was a budget and a policy election. Since then, government has figured out through immigration, special interest groups, LGBT, public service, military, RCMP, they have moved the bar so low to pander to specific identity groups so that they don't have to talk to the individual and they can garner their support. Just one conservative has to say, I'm going to rip up Bill's C-71 and restore and remove all of Trudeau's gun rights. Next thing you know, boom, 2 million votes. And this is what it has allowed them to do. We don't discuss policy anymore. You look at any provincial, municipal, or federal election, there is never a discussion on economic policy, reducing the debt, anything else like that. All of the policies are designed towards that.
I don't disagree. I agree with everything that you're saying.
Disenfranchised voter that no longer shows up, like my wife, who's 7 years younger than me, and she doesn't vote because my vote doesn't make a difference. And they created that on purpose since the 1980s.
And who were the original Trudeau maniacs that got Trudeau into office? Trudeau Sr.
That I don't know.
Well, that would have been the boomers. It would have been the essential electorate. Yeah, that was the boomers were the original Trudeau maniacs.
I would agree with you on
this time around, they were talking about the return of Trudeau mania, and that's attributable to the boomers being in charge of the universities and turning them into these communist indoctrination factories, where all the millennials came out as Trudeau maniacs as well.
You mean the sharp trained soldiers of 1992?
Which sharp trained soldiers?
So we started the sharp training in 1992.
Yeah,
that was the first initial change institutionally, where we had to be nicer and kinder and gentler, and green cards came out and trade school and basic QL training and stuff like that. The Constitution became effective in regards to you could no longer get thrown in jail on the parade square in the 80s like we used to. You'd be Sergeant Major march that man to jail. He's got dirty boots, literally. Don't matter what rank you were, off you went. Missing the lipstick in the left-hand bag of your chapstick in your left-hand bag, bootlegs in the right hand of the old M1984 ruck pattern, the old jump ruck they call it. Prior to that, you could go to jail, and the Charter and Constitution gave us actual rights and the actual system of justice, which is horrible. It destroyed discipline from my time into your time. And then
who did that though? who made this decision?
In your time, we trained the 1992 sharp trained soldiers on. That's all part of that boomer policy, whatever you want to call it, directed from above, because the government had the authority to interfere with the operations of each individual department.
But I mean, it was the boomers would have reached peak institutional power in the military first because of the lower retirement age and the high rate of attrition, and that's what we saw in the early 90s with the Somalia affair.
Plan.
Yeah, the Somalia affair. It was the boomer Lieutenant Colonel Matthew who gave orders to use fleeing unarmed peasant Somalian children for target practice, and said shoot between the skirts and the flip-flops. And it was the boomers who tortured Shadena Rowan to death and probably raped him with a nightstick. And then it was the Gen X'er, Kyle Brown, who blew the whistle on the whole thing, and he ended up getting scapegoated and sent to prison for 5 years. They blamed it all on him. So that seems to be a theme as well. Is this idea of corrupt leaders with whistleblower subordinates, Gen X whistleblower subordinates. I think probably the CSIS leaker, for example. And what the boomers will do is they'll blame the whistleblower. They'll crack down on the whistleblowers, like they said they were going to crack down on the military for leaking the information about everybody dying in the old folks' homes in the early pandemic, and like they're going after the CSIS whistleblower. It's basically the Somalia affair, but on a civilizational scale. And it's the same thing like Hillary Clinton, you know, and Julian Assange. He gets scapegoated for blowing the whistle, you know, and that's a massive shift away from what we saw during the boomers' early lives, because Bob Woodward would have been the one who had the contact deep throat that exposed the whole Watergate scandal and actually had the most popular U.S. president by way of the Electoral College vote, Richard Nixon, impeached. And, you know, that scandal was like over 18 seconds worth of audio tape that he had no obligation to record in the first place, but it was under subpoena. So he did break the law. That pales into comparison to what Hillary Clinton did.
Or Jody Wilson-Raybould had on the Telford and his staff, right?
Right. So, and that pales in comparison to what Hillary Clinton did with, you know, the deletion of 300,000 classified emails that were kept on an unsecure server in her bathroom.
Benghazi affair, take another one of Hillary Clinton's.
She doesn't face any consequences because, you know, you'll have the FBI head there, James Comey, come out and say that he couldn't establish intent, which isn't his job anyway. And that's analogous, I think, to what happened with the Board of Inquiry into the Somalia affair, where up and down the chain of command, the boomer chain of command, they all decided that the murder of those children was something that was better covered up than addressed. And they all kind of stick together like that. And now they're running all the institutions and, you know, exploiting the rest of us.
I'll just take you on a little personal history of Somalia and that whole affair. Couple things had happened. The Cold War had ended. Canada had no more purpose. We were pulling out of Germany at the time. The UN was brought into Somalia. The airborne was activated for that. I actually personally knew the sergeant major. He was not the greatest guy in the world to put in as the RSM, and he was replaced 3 weeks before they left. He was my company sergeant major, and he wasn't well respected at that time either. I don't use names. Mathieu is a product of the Quebec, old Laurentian Quebec elite, and a Vendu that that it speaks for itself. But out of the Somalia affair, I was in Ottawa at the time, and the Red Tape Action Team, the RATE it was, and my infantry, RCR infantry officer, and I can speak his name now because he's dead, was Lieutenant V.J. Bonamici, who, when I came to Ottawa to set up this project for this Red Tape Action Team from Somalia, from the Somalia affair, the SILT, the Somalia Inquiry Liaison Team, I was the sharp end of the stick for the communications design, setup, and installation of this whole new system. And Major Bonamici was now a major military policeman who was trying to bring to light all of the investigations that he conducted that were suppressed. And he died on a treadmill at NDHQ 2 weeks before he was to retire. Major Vince Bonamici. Okay. And he was a soldier. He was the epitome of a soldier and a leader of men. So when he pulled me aside and said, "Mark, they're coming after me," and I kid you not, this is what happened. He was like telling me all this stuff, and literally, I was senior NCO at the time. Literally, I was like, "I believe every word you're saying, sir. Every word you're saying." I couldn't do nothing about it, obviously. And 2 weeks before he was supposed to go in and give his testimony, he died on treadmill. And I still to this day question that, the whole cover up, like you're saying, and who was doing that.
Yeah, it's analogous to the Clinton body trail.
Yeah, and as a result of that, Somalia, they got gun shy. So when they sent us to Bosnia, we weren't there as peace enforcers. We were there as peacekeepers, and they kept that under wraps. and they kept all of the sirs that we were sending back at the time out of the media, and the Liberal government at the time I was there seeing these sir messages go out and seeing what was being told by the CBC. And that's the first time I ever questioned the CBC, and that was in 1992. That was in 1992, 93. And that's when I realized there was something wrong, and that's where the government was now protecting itself. And everything's gone downhill since then in regards to the state in which the government is able to get away with bloody blue murder, enslave our children in debt. And nothing's going to change in our political system until we actually and I'm not advocating for libertarian. Nothing is going to change until we put a political party nationally and provincially in each province that is actually wants to go back to the roots. And even if we wipe out our own debt and start anew, it's the only way that it's going to change. And I keep forgetting the name of what you say, the first revolution or whatever it is that's going to come. We're in the fourth turning. Now. The first turning.
Actually, the first turning would occur regardless. Yeah, the first turning would occur regardless, just demographically by natural attrition. So it wouldn't even really matter, if we had new political parties around at the time or not. But I can speak to that a little bit because, again, we're talking about institutional power, and the political parties are institutions for all intents and purposes. And so it's the old party guard that's doing things like rigging the nomination contests, going with Blandrew Scheer over Maxime Bernier at like 49.9 to 50.1 count. And when they ask for a recount, it's like, oh, we shredded all the ballots. And we see the election rigging going on in the United States. So there's a behind the scenes effort to shut the younger generations out of political power.
Hey, just going to interrupt you to give you 10 times this has happened to me. It happened again last week. Quinte Chamber of Commerce and Cogeco in the Belleville area refused me to be able to part of the Zoom for the Chamber of Commerce and refused me to be on the Cogeco live debate, even though I was perfectly willing to go and do all these debates, because we don't have a sitting member in Queen's Park. Therefore, they eliminate you from the riding. So the new blue party's running. I'm as a libertarian, and John Trammell, who's the most storied guy in the world for running in elections. He runs in every election. But when you say that they're keeping it and suppressing it, that's how they stop us from being heard. I tried to post a link to my newspaper, my college debate that I had today, and they took my post off the party page. They took my post off the friggin' personal page. No way I could link it.
Yeah, I understand like that you're a boomer, but you're not in the club. And I'm discussing a social trend, right? These are based on population statistics and history and trends that we can observe, through the lens of the Harvard Statistical Database. So it's not a black or white on or off state. That's just not how real world works. It's not digital, it's analog. And, the exceptions kind of prove the rule. Like a trend implies not all. So what I'm talking about here is a trend, that spans generations, goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And so, there would be, there are, definitely boomers that are on the right side of history out there. It's just that there are way too few of them. And that is kind of what characterizes the generational archetype of the prophet. That's the one who founds our religions, the current one being this cultural Marxism. Like I said, that happens again every 4 generations. The new theocracy is reimposed. It's a question of, who is doing it and not the tools that they're using to do it.
And see, I say it's not who is doing it, it's the tools that they've granted themselves to be able to grant them authority to do what they're doing. And I've never heard it put the way that you put it in regards to this fourth turning and the fourth generation. And it's an interesting concept to look at it that way. And how has wars, World War I, World War II, played into that? And I'll look at the philosophy and linking it behind that, because I wonder if there's that. Cause I've never looked at it that way. It's a fascinating terminology and time frame in which you put things in, and I haven't really put it into my time frame of pre-1972 or post-1972 and how all that came into play, and maybe that's part of it. but I've never heard it in that time frame, and it's a fascinating thing for me, and I'll probably spend the next week thinking about it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, if just briefly, if you count back 4 generations, you'll see the Second World War, the American Civil War, the American Revolution, the Salem witch trials, the French
Jesus
Revolution,
Christ.
the Napoleonic Wars, the War of the Roses, on and on and on, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. So I did.
Oh my God, I've never looked at it that way, Jeff.
Yeah, see, this is what I mean. Like, I'm talking about ultimate causes, and this is the thing that I think our ancestors were trying to warn us about. Like, every time one of these crisis eras comes around, we see like all of these new dystopian novels come on the scene. So in the lead up to the previous fourth turning, we saw Orwell and Aldous Huxley come on the scene, and we can see that they're just careful observers of human nature, and they see these social trends that seem to recur over and over and over again. So we have like the Newspeak, the Orwellian, all the Orwellianism with the kind of double
Mandates,
speak,
COVID vaccines, government knows best, trust the science. Those are all the new books.
And Aldous Huxley, he highlighted the fact that the sexualization of children is a natural constituent of tyranny, because the kids in Brave New World are forced to engage in erotic play. So, sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we didn't see that at any point. Now, that was something that apparently did happen in the lead up to the Second World War. And also, the first biomedical gender transition was performed by a guy named Magnus Hirschfeld in the Weimar Republic right around that time as well. And then 4 generations later, we see, what are the guys' name? The Wachowski brothers, creators of The Matrix. They came out in 2010 as transgender. So and that's what happens. You see, during the first turning, we see the GIs with very distinct gender roles. There are breadwinners and they are housewives. And during the second turning, those roles narrow a little bit, with men growing their hair long and women pursuing more careers. And then in the third turning, we see those gender roles narrow even a little bit more, where, I got my ear pierced when I was 9. And, and then in the fourth turning, gender roles are at their narrowest. And as we can see, it's an all out war on the idea that gender exists in the first place.
So that, I love that analogy. God, there's so much. I'm seeing you from the calling out boomers to a different way of starting to think, and I'm not trying to agree with you on it. I still don't like the fact of the boomer wording and the boomer blade when it's the government authority that allows it. But I just want to take you through something.
It's a question of who's wielding the authority. That's where I'm coming from. And look, like I put these things out there. I've been using this line, the boomers must be stopped. It's been a hashtag of mine for the last 2.5 years.
I know that, and you've seen me. I've commented 100 times about, dude, you and I got to have a discussion on this to see that it's not
sure. And that's why I do that, right?
In charge, but prior to the boomers, somebody else was in charge, making the same rules for their benefit. And it's to the disbenefit of all of us, the detriment of all of us. But
and that's why I do that. That's why I kind of put those controversial statements out there, is so I can sort of draw the fire and have the conversation.
Debate is always great.
Yeah.
That's, even if you're wrong.
Well, I mean, you'll learn something, right? And
so I just want to take you back about 2 years ago. This came up, the 60s, and the upheaval of the social unrest was during what you would call the second turning, right?
Which year are we talking about?
We're 60s to 70s.
You're probably transitioning into the second turning. The first turning would have gone up to
RFK or RFK said something. Or no, it was Vivek Ramaswamy. It was one of the two of them anyway. And he said, have you ever given thought to the rise of I'll call it feminism in the 60s, bra burning in the 70s and all that stuff. He said, have you ever given thought to the destruction of the family unit? Plus, with monetary policy in 1968 changing in the U.S., they went to the Rothschilds banking system, fiat system. Actually, they reinforced it. It started in 1932. But the inclusion and political pressure to get women into the workforce doubled the amount of taxation that they were able to collect by having 2 people working in the home and the state looking after their children. And it has been that march away from the central core family unit and putting double the amount of people into the workforce to gain double the amount of taxation. So it's almost like he said, Was this designed this way to help service the debt by having double the amount of people in the workforce? And
It
it's
can
really a
appear that way.
fascinating methodology in which to bring in more taxation by creating a social
Yeah.
issue. We know all that happens. That's propaganda, right?
Yeah, but the GI women didn't enter the workforce, and they were the women who manned the factories while their husbands were overseas. So like that's not necessarily like
I'm talking
it looks that way in on the surface, but what really happens is, like you mentioned the feminist movement in the 60s. That would have been the second wave feminist movement. So that was the silent generation, and that's the generation that fought the Korean War, and they came back from the Korean War, and men and women marched alongside each other to get equal standing in the workplace. And then females entered the workplace with the silent generation, and things seemed to be going well. But then with the boomer generation, they brought in third wave feminism, which is the culturally Marxist version of feminism that casts men as the bourgeois and women as the proletariat. So men as the oppressors, women as the oppressed. And then the boomers would have entered the workforce, and that's when we saw like the complaints, really, like sexual harassment complaints and stuff like that going through the roof. And I saw this in my early career with the military and stuff. Like I was hearing all these stories about women hiding behind bookcases and waiting for somebody to swear so they could jump out and cry harassment and stuff like that.
Through that.
Yeah, and that wasn't the millennials that did that, right? And it wasn't Gen X either. And that's something else that you touched on there too when you were talking about identity politics, because it's ultimately cultural Marxism, and that's where it started, was with the boomers entering the institution. Because like Yuri Bezmenov, well, I mean, I attribute it to what Yuri Bezmenov said about the Soviet active measures and how ideological subversion is already underway, and you can't stop it.
One of the greatest
first
videos
generation
of all times in the 80s, and nobody really understands that it's been going on since the 70s in Canada, since Pierre Elliott Trudeau had his first visit to China and was a bona fide known communist.
Yeah, I'm aware of that, but really we could say it started before that, because the Soviets, the KGB, were applying active measures to Western populations in the wake of the Second World War, and the purpose of the first stage of ideological subversion, that being the demoralization of the young, was to go into the schools and give the kids all these communist nudges that would make them hate their society and turn them against it. And he said that those people graduated in the 60s, and that again would be the boomer generation. And he said that those people are already working within the institutions to actively co-opt them and turn them against us. And now that generation that was the subject of demoralization, the first stage of ideological subversion, that went into the institutions, started working to turn them against us. They're at peak institutional power. And as we can see, they are Marxist, and they have been turned against us.
It's one thing that I've learned is that this has been ongoing in its march towards democratic socialism. That's the word I was looking for, socialism or communism. And I was completely unaware of this. I thought everything was normal and life was going on. But now when you look back on it, it is absolutely this subversion. I got a daughter that's 21, a son that's 27, and a son that's 38, and they're all three different people. And what my son learned are 7 years difference because of deployments, and I mean literally because of deployments. The schooling that my daughter got, who's younger, and her ideology and her methodology that she came home with was completely different from my 27-year-old, and my 38-year-old from my first marriage in London has no clue what these kids are talking about. And that's just 2.5 generations. It's scary.
Yeah. And that tracks with that tracks with boomer ascendancy as well. It's like I was saying, like that demoralized generation is now the deans and the tenured professors. So they're the ones that are imposing this. Well, I mean, it's the postmodernist and the critical theorists, the neo-Marxists, I guess. Post-Marxists, right?
Jordan Peterson does a wonderful explanation of how that has transpired in the last 30 years.
Right, and Jordan Peterson is basically the Noah of his day. If you look back at the Old Testament too, you'll see the elder prophet with the long gray beard. That is the generational archetype of the boomers. It's when the prophet is in his elderhood, it's hard times for the rest of us, and that's when you see the apocalypse. The first three horsemen being war, famine, disease, and behold the pale horse, and he who sat on him was death. And I think it's an analogy for state collapse that occurs in a fourth turning. And if you look for the elder prophet, I mean, it could be Obi-Wan Kenobi, it could be Gandalf the Grey, it could be Yahweh, Abraham, Lot, Moses, Noah, Muhammad. Every time you see that figure in one of the stories, it's democide, essentially. That's what we see across the board, and that's what I believe we have in Canada right now. Is we have Canada's first democide, just based on the all-cause mortality statistics at the moment.
It's amazing on how much we agree with, and it's amazing how much I've learned tonight. But I still disagree with your boomer analogy. The boomers can't.
It's not mine, though.
Pardon me?
It's not mine. It's I'm relying on, like, I'm not the scholar. It's Neil Howe.
So as long as we tag this with boomer and not acknowledge it as the government creating rules for itself, rules for thee, not for rules for me, not for thee, right? You know, that old military analogies. And that can only exist with the authority to do so. That's why we need to change things to be able to hold these people to account and put them in jail. And that's never existed in the Canadian Constitution. People can get away with murder. René Lévesque driving over a person drunk 4 times over the limit while smoking a cigarette, you know what I mean? And he got away with it. But it's, again, we're not going to change. But I literally cannot stress enough that it's not to blame the boomers. It's to blame the legislation that was set up by every person before them to allow them to get away with it. And
they're still doing it.
And even if it's Pierre Poilievre, the youngest conservative or, World Economic Forum young leader, pick the youngest 25-year-old person that's coming up is still going to be able to use those rules to do the exact same thing to the first turning, second turning, third turning, and fourth turning. As long as those rules are in place that allow them to get away from it and there's no accountability, then we will always be in this first to fourth turning, as you put it.
I agree that we need to harden our systems.
It needs to change.
Yeah, those systems need to be hardened up to prevent this kind of thing from happening again in the future, as it is forecasted to do again in 2108 when the next fourth turning occurs. But they're still doing it, and like you're talking about there's some laws that were made like in the 70s, but we didn't really enter this era of collapse until the 2010s. So I think that again sort of underlines the idea that it really kind of depends on who's wielding the gun as to whether it's used for good or evil. And since we're kind of talking about, I mentioned the boomer ascendancy. That's a term that I throw out there sometimes. Here's another trend that I noticed that tracks boomer ascendancy, though. So this is a little TikTok video here. That's the title is "Share of U.S. Active Duty Military Deaths by Year," and we can see here is the suicide rate over here in the red. This is a circle for those of you guys just looking like a pie chart. So you got about 9.69 deaths in the active duty U.S. military. 9.69 deaths are attributable to suicide, and accident is 64.93. So this takes this starts. This is 1981. That's how it stacks up. It's accident, illness, homicide, suicide, and let's see what happens. It's 1 minute.
Mommy, your daddy, your brother, your sister, the dog, the cat, the fish was home when you left. You're right. And that's the reason you left. You're right. I left my home. I left my home. To join the army. To join the army. I left my home. I left my home. To join the army. To join the army. The day I left. The day I left. My mama cried. My mama cried. She thought that I. She thought that I. Would surely die. Would surely die. I left my way. I left my.
Okay, so 2008 is when the fourth turning really starts to kick in. And we started out at under 10%, and we're now at about 20%, just over 20. Suicides, that is.
She knew that I would die at war. Would die at war. I left my son.
And now we're all the way up to 39.45% in December of 2022. So we went from just under 10% to basically 4 times that, in terms of the percentage of overall deaths in the military. So the suicide rate seems to skyrocket concurrent to boomer ascendancy as well. And now we have Veterans Affairs offering veterans suicide, offering them MAID, to save money, it seems. Well, I mean, not like the government doesn't take enough money, but they can never have enough. So it's all the way down to that. So there seems to be, I'll throw back to Bruce Cannon-Gibney because he calls it a generation of sociopaths. He uses, the polling data, especially from the early 80s, that shows disproportionately high rates of antisocial personality disorder within the boomer generation. So basically a low regard for human life, I think, is what we're looking at. And I mean, I've done a couple other segments here on just naming all the serial killers of the 20th and the 21st century. And the thing is, I mean, when they first came on the scene, there was supposed to be 35 to 45, but they're not anymore. Robert Pickton was apprehended in 2002 at the age of 52. Russell Williams was 47. That's roughly the same age as Paul Bernardo. And Alan Legier, of course, was also a boomer. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Find, Torture, Kill.
You're classifying a bunch of people you call boomers.
Yeah.
And you're associating them with the individual's actions. You are promoting
not exactly
your premise by using your own propaganda.
It's not propaganda; those are statistics.
But you're implying that they're all boomers, whether they are or not, to try to reinforce your boomer theory.
Well, no, I'm not implying that they are. I'm saying I went and I checked. I checked the birth dates on them, and I can't really find anybody that was born outside of the bracket of 1940 to about 1965. So all of them appear to have been born between 1940 and 1965.
I don't disagree with your list, but it's your association with boomers. It's irrelevant. Just like you said in the analogy of a gun, I can take my AR and place it on my desk. I could take my pistol and put it out on and that will remain not in motion until someone touches it.
But I'm talking about people, not objects.
Yeah, but just because a gun is an object or a boomer is a time frame, it doesn't mean that all of the people that you just associated are part of that. You might have said that the risk is higher.
No, but that's not what I was saying. You're drawing some conclusions. Like I haven't advanced that.
I'm not butthurt.
I'm not implying that. I'm just saying that there is a trend that exists within the boomer generation. I'm not saying that it applies to everybody. And again, by the word trend, we necessarily mean not all. Just a disproportionate number relative to other generations. And I think that's reflected in the apprehensions of serial killers since the 1980s up throughout the 2010s.
So now we got the school shooters of the millennials. I don't even know what they call the newest generation anymore.
Millennials, yep. Yeah, but that's a different thing.
Those are the millennials that are representative of all millennials. Well, I'll tell you this, it's probably a bigger one than the boomers.
No, but it is a trend. It's a trend in the millennial generation. It's not representative of all of them.
And again, that's the cultural Marxism and the indoctrination system within our school programs that makes them think that they're special and nobody's special but your own purpose that you have on this earth.
I disagree. I think that, everybody always points to, say, the fact that all these mass shooters are on SSRIs, and then they try to attribute mass homicide to the SSRIs, but SSRIs are an antidepressant. And so I think it's more attributable to depression. And what's happening with the kids is, they've had all the hope stolen from them, and their schools are telling them that, they're evil because they're of their skin color and they shouldn't have been born and their society hates them. And so they go nihilistic. And that's another thing that tracks boomer ascendancy as well, because like you mentioned, Gen X, we didn't have any mass shooters as far as I can tell. We were the gangbangers of the 1980s and brought 186,000 guns to school every day in the United States.
I was telling that story that I used to bring my 22 Cooey A short into the Brighton Public School back in the 60s and 70s. I was born in 63, so I couldn't have been more than 7 years old. But me and my brother used to bring our 22s to school so that we could shoot rabbits on the way home and give them to our mom.
Yeah. Oh, there's nothing wrong with guns. I love guns.
Yeah. You understand what I'm saying? But you're right. We didn't go around shooting up places. That was the
Mark Le
crazy
Pen did.
veterans from World War II that were doing
Mark Le
that.
Pen did. Mark Le Pen shot up Lake Hole Polytechnique. That was the first mass shooting in Canada, and he was a boomer.
Yeah. Well, what about the 7 since then? They weren't boomers. They were younger people of whatever generation.
Right.
I don't know that.
And one thing
Or,
about so
what was the young
the
corporal
millennials
that was on the legislature in Quebec shooting up the what was his name there? I can't remember him. Denis Lepine. Denis Lepine.
Okay.
You don't know who that is?
I mean, vaguely I remember.
With
But
his
the
9mm SMG in the Quebec legislature.
okay,
Take
probably
a
a
look at that.
millennial.
He probably was a boomer, by the way.
Oh, was he? Okay.
Yeah, probably. Denis Lepine.
So I can check, but
yeah. Denis Lepine.
So the mass shooter component of it, the thing is that the millennials follow the generational archetype of the hero, and the boomers follow the generational archetype of the prophet. And those two archetypes, they tend to have more in common with one another than they have in common with Gen X, because that's how generations work, is we tend to have more in common with our grandparents' generation than we do with our next elders. And it has everything to do with the fact
that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, young people, they rebel against, their parents, their next elders. And so the boomers would rebel against the GIs with the gender roles and stuff like that. And Gen X would rebel against that. And then you have the millennials rebelling against the Gen X'er kind of disposition. And so they end up having more in common with the boomer archetype than they do with the Gen X'er archetype. And again, the despair is definitely, I think, the factor there. It's not sadism. It's sadism when it's a serial killer, but not when it's a mass shooter. That's despair. That's my take anyway.
Interesting thought. I've never looked at it that way. I only see any mass shooter or any killing, whether it be on the street in downtown Ottawa or Halifax or wherever you might be, as nobody else's reason or opportune. It's an individual's choice to be evil. And there ain't no reason in the world for whatever opportune that they use or whatever label they want to put onto somebody. It still never excuses the fact that it isn't an ideology. It is an individual with intent to harm. And we've known lots of people like that in our lifetime. And one bad person with the intent to harm will not be stopped by any laws out there. And it's an individual action.
So
not
I just
group think.
I agree. It is an individual action, and only that individual is responsible. And I do think it's also valuable to have a discussion around the societal factors that create these monsters. But at the end of the day, if you cross the line, you go to jail. Denny Lortie.
Denis Lortie, that's his name. Yeah.
Yeah, born 1959. So.
He was actually pretty cool watching him. The Sergeant at Arms did an amazing job. That was live on TV, directly coming from the Quebec legislature, live on TV.
And another one that I would point out was the FLQ crisis as well.
Yeah,
that was also a boomer initiative.
Well,
and that is kind of the thing.
I lived through that. I was 10 years old. I can remember the troops on Parliament Hill. I can remember all that, the live. I can remember Trudeau doing the pirouette. My father cursing him the whole time because he hated any liberal, because he fundamentally changed the military with Hellier's corporals going from lance corporal to master corporal, and people that got promoted didn't deserve it, under the old system. And so he hated Trudeau for that reason, and he called him a traitor with the bilingualism and the loss of the great military that my father served in the 50s and 60s, right? 104 CF-104 Voodoos at CFB Uplands here. I worked in the same hangar my father did at one point here, building that or redoing that hangar. And, and there was 104 CF-104 Voodoo fighters on the tarmac, a picture with my dad in the picture. And we'll be lucky if we can field 12 CF-18s today, operational duty, based in Cold Lake and Vegreville. 12.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I want to touch on here, just to kind of explain, because again, we're talking about a social trend, not a social rule. It's not a blanket statement. It's just a general statement. It's most, but not all, but I'm not going to say most, not all, because that's a redundant statement and indicative of the kind of like Orwellian political correctness that we live under. And I'm just not going to participate in that. That's why I use general statements. It's to deliberately trigger people. So they'll come and fight with me. But
I'm here.
Exactly, it works.
I'm just trying to get you. I'm trying to get you to direct it to where it resides and who makes the rules that are applicable over whatever generation you want to apply it, and they're all going to stay in place when we are long dead.
And that seems to be what we've been doing over the ages, is just hardening the systems more and more for the next generation that follows the prophet generational archetype to reach peak institutional power, and then test how good we have done at restraining them. And I wanted to kind of touch on, because we're talking about a lot of stuff. I know trashing the boomers pretty hard. That's what I do. I've been doing that since day one. But
well, you know,
yeah, okay, fair enough. But I just want to put my finger on what it is that we kind of need to do to resolve these things. Now, first of all, like I said, it's going to resolve through natural attrition anyway in about 2030. I think we could probably do better than that, and let's speed this thing up a little bit and just ask them to retire, because, you know, and that's why I talk about these things. The other thing, in order to prevent it from happening again, to finally take the lessons from history so that we don't keep doing this until we finally destroy ourselves, what is unique about the boomer generation, both according to Neil Howe and according to Bruce Cannon Gibney, is the permissive parenting style of that commie bastard Dr. Spock that was so pervasive during the post-World War II era. And this is what always happens. It's always the case that the generation that surmounts the civilizational crisis has a ton of kids. They build the institutions to new heights. They introduce new technologies, higher standards of living than the world has ever seen. And then that generation, they raise their kids as indulged. So you end up with a massive generation that's been raised. This is the language of Strauss-Howe generational theory. And also here is the AI's right up on it. Permissive parenting, also referred to as indulgent parenting, is characterized by high levels of warmth and responsiveness from parents, but low levels of structure and discipline. This style is often criticized by therapists and pediatricians, as it may not provide children with essential life skills such as following rules and respecting authority. I saw that throughout my entire career. They didn't follow the rules at all. The key features include high parental support and responsiveness, nominal structure or control, few demands or expectations placed on children, little punishment or consequences for misbehavior. Parents are nurturing, warm, and affectionate. And here we have potential outcomes. It says children may develop a sense of entitlement and struggle with self-regulation and self-control. AIDS epidemic, for example. May lead to lower self-esteem and increased aggression, can result in anxiety over grades and difficulties with feedback in academic settings. Actually, Bruce Cannon Gibney points out that the boomers experienced the highest grade inflation on record because they only got about 70% of what the rest of us did on the SAT scores, but they got straight A's. And finally, we have however, some research suggests that permissive parenting can have protective factors against substance abuse and delinquency alongside better social skills and academic performance. Well, I don't know about that in light of the hippie movement, LSD being the drug of choice for the boomer generation. So that's what it is. It's how we raise children. We need to raise them with structure and discipline. I think probably like the Spartan approach, you know, give me the boy at the age of 5 and I'll show you the man at the age of 11, send him off into the woods and tell him not to come home until he's wearing a wolf or a house coat, that kind of thing. So hard times create strong men.
I grew up in a different household where beatings were a regular occurrence and children disappeared. I drank from the garden hose. That the people that were born in the late 60s and 70s, talk about that generation. I'm close to you. So I'm like I said, I'm at the tail end of the boomers, but I was beat to hell all the way growing up. It was straps in school, the whole bit. I'm only 61. And I mean, literally
pretty close to Gen X.
I was a rebellious. Had I not joined the military at my mom's insistence, I probably would have been sitting over there in Kingston at a cell block. And I kid you not.
Oh, yeah.
It was the outlet I needed to learn structure, duty, honor, discipline, because I had none before then. And I'm a product of the boomers.
No, I can tell, like, it's almost like I've developed kind of a sense for these things now. It's I can almost tell the difference between somebody who was raised in the permissive parenting style and somebody that wasn't. It's usually that they got their nose up in the air, like the Obama face. They put their nose up in the air and wave it at you, like Obama and Hillary do, and now they got Trudeau doing it in a big way too.
Literally, the 80s were the start of that, the real start of that permissive parenting. And also the structural changes within the schools, allowing the state to actually have more control over your children. But it really came to light in the 90s and progressed to the absolute worst in the last 20 years. In the last 2 generations of children that have been put through school are the most horrific, damaged, I won't call them self-entitled, damaged children.
Yeah.
Emotionally damaged children by state indoctrination.
Yeah, I'm just pulling this up again because my recollection of the books that I'm talking about, like my understanding is that people moved away from the permissive parenting style during the second turning, and that is again like it has to do with how we raise children during each turning. And in the first turning, we raise them as indulged, and in the second turning, we raise them as abandoned. And that's how the nomad generational archetype, which Gen X follows, is raised. Is they're raised as abandonment. So we would have been like the latchkey kids in the 1980s who were jumping our big wheels over ramps and shooting our pellet guns. The Bart Simpson generation, basically. It's the wild children.
Yeah, but I grew up in that generation, though. I was.
You're pretty close. You're pretty close as a younger boomer.
1980. So,
and again, it's a trend, right? It's not that every boomer was raised with a permissive parenting style, and it's concentrated within the upper class. It's concentrated within the cities as well. Cosmopolitanism is definitely at play here, and that's something that Ray Bradbury really, I think, touches on in Fahrenheit 451, for example, and the attack on intellectualism, of course, too. But but yeah, I mean, it's everything is happening in the city. All the corruption and the tyranny and stuff like that. It's all happening in the city. And as soon as you leave the city, and same thing with the Hunger Games, right? It's the concentration of power within the cities, and people tend to be even more indulged within the cities. They have no idea what it's like to face challenges.
So that whole analogy you just used in the Hunger Games is the government as a whole and its authority and capacity to overrule us versus the country and your individual rights. They used to be more 50-50. Now it's 90-10. And that's due to the power that they have granted themselves through the new charter and constitution. I've looked at this for years, trying to figure out where all this changed. And it was the implementation of the new charter and the new constitution that allowed them to seek this power and grow the governance, remove private property rights, remove the right for self-defense of property and the self-defense of self. Not your limited right to self-defense of yourself these days. And in so doing that, it allowed the state to grow and allowed them to get away with everything.
Yeah.
Where they used to be accountable by the vote. And they're not accountable to anything anymore because they've wrote themselves protections not to be. Is Trudeau going to go to jail for doubling the national debt in the last 7 years? That took 40 years of every prime minister since 1972 to create $626 billion. And now he's enslaved our children with $640 billion more, almost $1.3 trillion. Is he going to go to jail for doing that? Is he ever going to be held to account or prime minister before him?
And I mean, Eddie Cornell, thankfully, one of our founding members of Veterans for Freedom, is suing Trudeau personally and Freeland personally and Jody Thomas personally for the Emergency Measures Act invocation because it was declared ultra vires. And at least when you can show that they acted illegally and in bad faith, you can sue them individually instead of just suing the taxpayer. So I think that lawfare is kind of the key battle space right now, probably moving into the political battle space here soon. But yeah, I mean, we got to do it ourselves. That's the thing is the people in charge, like I say, are kind of the ones guiding all the corruption, and they pick,
So Jeff,
yeah,
you are the kind of person that needs to run that isn't going to be socially constructed to your speak, and you need to find a party that's going to you're safe to run in that believe in that, because the current mainstream parties don't believe in what you and I are talking about.
No, they're Marxist.
They don't care. And I'm not advocating for any political party. I want to be very clear about that. I even though I might be one, it's irrelevant. as long as we keep voting for this base that is ensuring that we stay serfs, it is never going to change, because it doesn't matter if you place a boomer with a Gen X, a millennial, or a Gen Z. I finally got them all right in a row. It doesn't matter if you put a Gen Z in power as the prime minister tomorrow. The conditions which allow them to get away with what they were doing with the Emergency Act and vaccine mandates and everything else like that still exist for them to do it again. And until we change that structure and write in legislation that holds them to account, nothing is going to change. And maybe this fourth turning is the new change. I don't know.
It is. That's when institutions are torn down and rebuilt. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, but there has also been like too many examples of just flagrant disregard for the law with the, not just the Emergency Measures Act invocation, but with the mandates. I don't care what any judge in this country says, like all of it was illegal. But the problem is, like, you know, the Supreme Court, which is the boomers, they came out and said, everybody in the Supreme Court, everybody who works here is vaccinated. And we made sure they had their opportunity to stand for bodily autonomy, which is what they stood for when, you know, the draft was enacted under Nixon for the Vietnam War. But, you know, now it doesn't really seem like it had anything to do with principle, does it? It's because
no, and I'll give you an analogy. When I was arrested February 20th, there was a female OPP officer who we tried to bring on to the stand. And I said to this very nice, the OPP treated me great. I said to the girl there, I said, do you know who Dr. Henry Morgenthaler is? He's probably 30 years old. And she said, no, who is he? And I said, that's the reason why you have a vaccine mandate. Do you know who he is?
Morgenthaler, I've heard the name, yeah.
He's the person who was running an illegal abortion clinic, and Jane Doe and him were arrested. And he fought and won all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada for a woman to choose what she wanted with her body. Whether you agree with abortion or not, it's irrelevant. That feminist or that women's right case set the precedent where women and Section 7 of the Charter were first tested in court, and they won the right to choose what goes into their body. And I said to her, I said, do you know who that is? And she said, no, I don't know who that is. And I said, that's why you have a vaccine mandate, because your generation of feminists have forgot this. And that's really the scary part. I'm old enough to know where nobody else knows in some cases, and seen freedom on our side of the road and rights on our side of the road that don't exist anymore, that generationally kids will never know they existed.
Yeah. And that's right. I mean, like that's what we're really fighting for here, is that future generations of Canadians are not born into serfdom and never know freedom, because once that happens, it's never coming back. And that is another key feature of the fourth turning, is this kind of reinstitution of slavery, child sacrifice. And I think that's what's actually happening, say, for example, in the Garden of Eden story, because we see all the same archetypes in that as well. I mentioned the different biblical stories. So I'll just, 1 second here. I think I need to give you a share screen. I'm going to put that up for 1 second and then just fire up a quick PowerPoint slide here. This is part of a much bigger presentation that I'm constantly working on, and someday it will be a pretty mind-blowing video. But for now, I think I'll just give you kind of the relevant portions that we're talking about right now. Okay, I think I will start it here. And oh shoot, look at that, that's the beginning. Hang on a second, can you see that? Well, here,
yeah, I can see it. I have to get up close to read it, though. It's not that big in my
yeah, no problem. I'll walk everybody through it, but I kind of screwed up when I was firing up. Okay, so let me try and start it here. Okay, so right there I have the cover of Dr. Benjamin Spock's book, The Common Sense Book of Baby Care and Child Care. That is the permissive parenting style that was pervasive in the post-World War II era. And I was just checking as to when it was like widely employed, because I remember reading in Bruce Ken Gibney's book, he gets right into it. And it seems like it kind of went away in the early 70s there. So during the second turning, when the nomad generational archetype Gen X would have been being born. So yeah, I mean, if you're closer to that bubble, like I said, these are trends, right? Like and they ebb and flow. They're not digital. They don't have hard boundaries or anything like that.
I remember this as a kid. I do remember this as a kid, and women talking about it as a kid. My mother's groups, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. And you know, the GI women were just known to be like just a force to be reckoned with in the home, right? Like they did it all. So if we go into the crisis area, here's the fourth turning that I was talking about. So this is where we are now. It started with the global financial crisis in 2008 and culminated in the full-blown civilizational crisis of the pandemic. And looks like we're heading into World War III. We have yet to actually reach the climax of the fourth turning. I think that's probably right around the corner, looking at the American election and whatnot. Yeah, stay tuned for that. I hope everybody's prepped. But if we roll the clock back 4 generations, we can see during the Great Power Cyclum, that started with the Great Depression and culminated in World War II. That was the full-blown crisis. Prior to that, during the Civil War Cyclum, there was the Civil War, 4 generations before the Second World War, and 4 generations before the Civil War, we had the American Revolution during the Revolutionary Cyclum. So if we, let me see. Yeah, and that goes on. I'm going to show you. So here are the archetypes. You've got the elder prophet, the midlife nomad, and the young hero. So the elder prophet in Star Wars is Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's always represented as an old man with a longer gray beard, and he's the one setting the tone and direction for the mission. And what they're actually doing is they send the hero archetype off to settle their old score from when they were young. In this case, it looks like Russia, as in the Cold War era adversary, that they're sending the millennials off to fight. And that's what Obi-Wan is doing in Star Wars, is he's sending Luke off to settle his old score with the Sith. And the problem that they have in Star Wars is that Obi-Wan is the only Jedi of his generation. So that's the issue, is it's one of proportionality when it comes to this trend. And then there's the midlife nomad, leading people and acting as an intermediary between the peak institutional power elders and the young heroes. So he's the one who kind of keeps everybody grounded. You know, he looks at the elder prophet and says, I don't know about all this Force stuff. I never really saw any reason to believe it. We're the most secular generation, by the way. I'm an atheist. And he looks at Luke and kind of says, yeah, okay, kid, just try not to get us all killed. Now, we can see this represented again. If we just change this up a little bit, here is the same archetypes.
Wow.
Right? Odin, he is the elder prophet who sends Thor off to wage war, and the guy in the middle is Loki, the midlife nomad. And the nomad tends to have a bit of a dark streak. We're the dark heroes. Like when Gen X was rising, it was Chronicles of Riddick, it was Jason Statham in The Transporter, Dexter Morgan, the benevolent serial killer, and so on and so forth. So they tend to be the dark heroes. Batman is definitely a nomad.
You really think it's that I know it's programmed, but that's like an amazing
insight
to the programming of this first, second, third, and fourth that you're talking about. And I understand propaganda and how it works and how it's been going on as long as radio has been alive and television and media. But, get away from the fancy TV personalities that reinforce the point. It's true, though.
Yeah.
It's true.
And this is really, like, we see like these differences. Crazy. The generations are different. There's a kind of disposition that a generation develops because of how they spend their formative years, and how you spend your formative years varies depending on your age, location, and history relative to the previous crisis. Because, like I said, we raise children differently in each one of the turnings. So each one of these guys are somewhat different from one another because of how they spent those formative years. But we see it's the same cycle, 4 archetypes that just repeat in the same order over and over and over and over and over again. So moving on, this is how far back does this go? Well, I mean, check this out. Here's Yahweh in the Garden of Eden, and he's looking at Adam and Eve. So Yahweh being the elder prophet, the Adam and Eve being the hero archetype. They're seen as civic-minded and pure, looking to serve, somewhat servile, I would say. And Neil Howe said in The Fourth Turning Is Here, released last year, that the question right now is whether the millennials will follow anyone. So that's what we see, and or that's the kind of what we're waiting to see. And
well, they certainly can't fight.
Well, I mean, I sparred with both generations in boxing and mixed martial arts, and I would say that the millennials are tougher. But the boomers are older than me, to be fair. So I mean, they're cage fighters, and we were the first generation of cage fighters. We're the daredevils. We're the underprotected children who come of age as kind of thrill-seeking daredevils. And you saw like X Games come on the scene. There's all the skateboarding and snowboarding and cage fighting and all of these kinds of extreme sports. And then we became Kill with our
Now it's
first
Yu-Gi-Oh!
generation.
On TikTok.
Yeah, no kidding. But yeah, if we take a look at these, let's have a look here. So here are the archetypes: elder prophet, midlife nomad, and we see that Yahweh is the elder prophet. The young hero is Adam and Eve, and then that leaves who else is in the story? Well, the midlife nomad is probably the serpent. And I think what's happening here is that we're looking at an inverted paradigm. So this is essentially propaganda. It's akin to, I would say, the Matrix, where in the Matrix, that's a fourth turning, and the elder prophet would be the archetype, or sorry, the architect, right?
Well, it is 100 years. They suspect it's been 100 years since the
and that's
what was the name of that place in the Matrix? Zion. Interesting name, eh?
Yeah,
was created, right?
The saeculum, the great year, because they analogize the four turnings to the seasons of a year, going from spring to summer to autumn to winter. Winter would be right now during the crisis when times are at their darkest, as opposed to just days. So sorry, I just lost my train of thought there, but I'll kind of
the inverted
the Matrix. The Matrix and the inverted paradigm, right? The thing is, in the Matrix, Neo is the young hero, and he knows something is wrong, and he wants to do something about it. This is how they come of age in the third turning, and he eventually, like, it's Morpheus who is the midlife nomad in the story, and he's the guy who says, "Take the red pill." So what's happening in the Garden of Eden story? Well, I think that, eat this fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is actually analogous to take the red pill, see the world for what it really is, understand good and evil. And it was Yahweh who told them that if they ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that they would surely die on that day. And the serpent said, "You will surely not die, for you will know good from evil, and you will become like gods." The thing is that he was telling the truth. He told them the truth. They came to know that they were naked and that there was some evil going on. It's very vague as to what that evil was. But, they became ashamed and started hiding their nakedness. And that's when the elder prophet noticed and said, "Oh, you know the difference between good and evil." And he banished them. And that's what happened during the pandemic, is everybody who stood up and said that there's something wrong going on here, they got banished from the institutions. So the thing is that the elder prophet, like, we tend to think of him in the Old Testament as being the good guy in the story, but I think that we tend to revere our crisis elder leaders when in fact they are probably the reason that we are in a crisis. And this goes all the way back to, like, this is a story about the transition from a hunter-gatherer society to an agrarian society. And what's happening is that, well, Yahweh refers to himself as we and us multiple times, which indicates to me that there are more of him, more than just him alone in the Garden of Eden. It sounds like perhaps they're his peers. It's a generation, and we're using archetypes to represent a generation, which is kind of what we do now. It's just sort of the key figures in the story that we talk about, not all the people that are backing them up and supporting them. And it would have facilitated oral transmission of the story if they just stuck to the archetypes instead of giving all the details in a historical manner as we do right now. And of course, it's all shrouded in metaphor and hyperbole, and poetic license is taken. So anyway, yeah, he banishes them. And then we come into what I'll call the agrarian saeculum. And so Adam and Eve, they have kids. So these are the new generations. Now, because there's only 4 generational archetypes, Adam and Eve follow the hero archetype, which is the same as the GIs followed from the Second World War. And the first generation, that would be the next generation of prophets. So that's Cain.
Yeah.
That's Cain, right? And then Abel is the one after that. So he would be the nomad, as in Gen X. And yeah, and that's what we see happening is as they come of age, Cain follows in the footsteps of his father, and he is a farmer, but the Gen X nomad what's his name again? Abel. He goes off and he does his own thing, and that's what the nomad does. Is he leaves the place of his birth when he comes of age, and he goes somewhere else, like the San Francisco 49ers of the original California Gold Rush, who went on to become the veterans of the who led on the battlefields of the American Civil War, so he actually develops a new technology which is herding. Cain doesn't actually develop a new technology, and right now all the technology that we rely upon is still the same technology as it was from World War II. It hasn't fundamentally changed. It's just that the components have gotten smaller and the networks have gotten bigger. So Cain is a farmer like his father, but as we move through the turnings, the third turning being autumn, we see that Cain, his offering isn't good enough for. I take this to mean that Abel was more prosperous than Cain. That everything kind of fell apart as soon as the GIs were out of the way. So that would be the Adam and Eve. As soon as Adam's out of the way, like the farm starts falling apart, and Cain's not quite as prosperous, but Abel's doing pretty good, and so Cain's countenance falls. And I think the story about Cain and Abel, especially when it comes to the slaying of Abel, is really one about why envy is such a deadly sin. And so it's probably the deadliest of all sins. And I think what we might be looking at here, if we're dealing with archetypes, is more like the world's first genocide than just one brother murdering another. So, and again, we see like the highest death rate right now being within Gen X, especially from suicide. We have had the highest rate of suicide on record since the lost generation of World War I. Our entire lives, like the average age for suicide in the late 90s was like 22 or something, and now it's like closer to 50. So it tracks with Gen X. And then we see after the slaying of Abel, Cain goes through the wandering, and he eventually has a son. That son would be the next generation of heroes, like the GIs, like Adam and Eve, and that's Enoch. And then I think Enoch founds the city of Enoch. He's the one who builds the institutions to new heights, like the GIs would have done in the post-World War II era, and new technologies, higher standards of living. But we give Cain the credit for it, I think, in the same way that we give Lincoln credit for freeing the slaves, when in fact he never fought on any battlefield. Those were his juniors doing the fighting. The idea that we give the credit to the troops seems to be a fairly modern conception, where we say the GIs won the Second World War, as opposed to the people who drove them to war. That seems to be a new phenomenon. So there's the whole cycle shown there. Prophet being Cain, nomad being Abel, and Enoch being the hero. And then it just goes on from there. You've got the flood with Noah, and the funny thing about Noah is it says something like he's a good man for his generation and that's something Jordan Peterson points out all the time. And I think that what that means is that he's a prophet generational archetype. So he's like the Obi-Wan figure. He's like the only Jedi of his generation. And the first thing he does when they come ashore is he strips off naked while he's drunk. And then you've got the Tower of Babel that comes in after that. I think we're in a Tower of Babel right now. It's an analogy for like civilizational collapse, and we can see how the duckspeak is sitting in there. Like Marxists, they use the same words as us, but they're actually speaking a different language, and everybody is just talking past each other, and we can't really communicate like we used to. So that's another thing that happens to. Yeah, that's what happens in the fourth turning. Sodom and Gomorrah, debauchery, right? Lot is supposed to be the good guy in the story, but when the Sodomites come looking for the angels who are there to rescue him, he sends his daughter out to be raped instead of one of the people that's there to rescue him, and they murder her. And then when he leaves, like his wife dies. I think he probably murders her too. I don't think she really turned into a pillar of salt. And then he blames his daughter for getting pregnant by him because he was drunk. I think he probably just raped her. But the fact of the matter is, he's the one telling the story. And that's another quality of the prophet generational archetype, is that when they come of age, they become the white collar class, because the institutions get built to new heights while they're growing up. And then there's a ton of white collar jobs that are available for them when they're coming into their early lives.
Write the story, my friend.
That's right. The victors, and the victors are the people running it.
The prophets.
And here's Yeah, but the prophets, yeah. Here's Abraham's sacrifice. And again, I think we're dealing with something that's more analogous to, that's more like a genocide. And these are archetypes that we're dealing with. And yeah, it's an era of child sacrifice. And that's what we see right now is the children were expected to sacrifice on behalf of the old with all this nonsense around masking. And of course, we've got all this biomedical gender transitions for kids out there now and things like that. And people are getting rich off of that. So we see that child sacrifice returning in the current fourth turning. And Abraham, like, he was good to go, but his hand was stayed by the angel. And unless I'm mistaken, the angels are the ones, like, they're demigods. So you have Abraham kind of taking the place of Yahweh in the story. So he's kind of like the god. And then man is represented as the younger generation. And then in between those two things, we have demigods. So that would indicate, I think, that this is a midlifer. And what are the angels and demons? Well, they're warriors, right? They're war veterans. So, and that's another quality of the nomad generational archetype, is that they're the ones who end up fighting like war. They're at war their entire lives, going right up until the fourth turning. So it seems that maybe this was an attempted genocide, and the elder prophet had his hand stayed by the midlife generation to prevent the genocide. And I think that's what I'm trying to do right now, but it's already well underway. Exodus, same thing. Moses, elder prophet with the long gray beard. He says, Ramesses, let my people go so they may serve me in the wilderness. So he has a falling out, a power struggle, and it's an era of balkanization. So they're balkanizing, they're exiting Egypt, and he's dragging all the kids out in the desert with him for almost certain death, and he murders them when they don't follow his orders to a T. And here is David and Goliath. This is a case where the elder prophet is overthrown by the young hero instead of him following him. And what we see is that he ushers in a good kingdom. Like, we end up with a really good kingdom, the likes of which we have right now, thanks to the GIs. And the problem comes in when the nomad demagogue appears. He's the one you really got to watch out for, the Gen X'er demagogue, and Neil House says that in the fourth turn. It's true. That's Justin Trudeau.
Joshua.
So,
Joshua.
Yes, it is Joshua. It's analogous. Yeah, that's analogous to Trudeau, because he serves the elder prophet, and the elder prophet tells him to commit a genocide in the town of Jericho, and he does it. Klaus Schwab is Silent Jenner, so he follows the artist archetype. That's the Darth Sidious character in that would be Dr. E. I think he's most analogous to Dr. Evil, and Darth Sidious would be more like George Soros, because those guys are both Silent Jenners.
It's really funny that you're going through this because, quote, I found Jesus at age 23 in my divorce, and I carried him around for 3 or 4 years, and people still refer back to that time because I was this kind of super soldier thing, and I turned into praying before doing everything before that. And when I realized the false prophets of the day, the televangelists in the 80s were actually false prophets, I dropped religion and I started studying all different types. And honestly, Jeff, by the end of the day, I'd studied Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, all 6 or 7 different sects. And what I come to realize is that it doesn't matter if you believe in a God or you don't believe in a God. It doesn't matter what your personal beliefs are. It's irrelevant. God allows good people to die, and God kills bad people throughout the whole history of time. And what you believe in that you get comforted with is totally your decision. I believe in a higher calling of some sort. I don't know what it is anymore, because I've seen too much of evil and I've seen too much of good. And I don't know how a good, ever-loving demigod of whatever religion would allow that under the guise of free choice while still trying to be good men. I'm not an atheist. I was, because I didn't know who any of this was, didn't do church, didn't do the, we celebrated Christmas for presents. And what I've really found out is that evil will encompass evil. And if you believe. And what is that God? I don't know. So every story that you're telling here, I know intimately. Every story.
Every story. And the thing, well, Jordan Peterson said, you know, you should, even if you don't believe, you should give the stories a charitable read, because your ancestors were doing the best they could with what they had at the time to explain what was happening and capture the lessons of their era. So that's what I did, and that's how I kind of came up with this, because this doesn't come from any other book. I'm just applying the theory myself, like using that lens of the generational archetypes, and this is what I see. And you know, with the fourth turning described in the story about Jesus, the demagogue is Judas Iscariot, and that's analogous to like Justin Trudeau. Again, he's a betrayer, he's a sellout. I think Metallica or Rage on Behalf of the Machine, they got the cold hard cash, and they're all about that now. They're split even in the elder Gen Xers, and it is the demagogue that you need to watch out for, like Trudeau, because that's the formula for genocide, is when the nomad serves the elder prophet. The one who revolts against the elder prophet, the compassionate revolutionary, seems to be the way to go. I think this is basically the central lesson of Christianity is, you know, nonviolent resistance, you know, and just let them do, it's self-sacrifice, right? Just let them do whatever it is that they're going to do, so everybody can see exactly how evil this era we're living through actually is. And so, I mean, that's what I did. I got arrested, you know, went to the convoy knowing I was going to get arrested, and I'm sure you did too. But those two characters, I just want to fill this out a little bit, but those two characters of Judas Iscariot and Jesus Christ are effectively analogous to the characters of Darth Vader and Han Solo, because Darth Vader is only about 9 years older than Han Solo. So they're both nomads. Anakin Skywalker is raised as abandoned. He's got a single mother household, and he's, you know, really handy. He does all that, you know, he does everything. He can fix anything, and he's, you know, very adventurous. He's like Tom Sawyer, which would have been, you know, a nomad archetype as well. Those are stories about Mark Twain's own boyhood. So he sells out, but eventually restores balance to the Force. Who knows if Justin Trudeau may do a mea culpa and expose everything that's really going on.
Never.
So that's but anyway, I think
he literally is the useful idiot to the raving point of stark reality, and has no clue.
No.
He has no clue. What he thinks he's doing is morally, judicially, and factually right. He has no conscience, because I don't know what generation he is, but he truly believes in what he's doing in his own demigod mind is right. So it's hard to find fault with a fool. It's hard to find fault with a fool, even though I hold him accountable for everything. But it's hard to find fault with a fool.
Yeah, and I do find room for compassion for Trudeau. Like, look at the parenting that he would have had, right? And I think that he was probably raised rather something. Yeah, I mean, what must that have been like?
The Penthouse magazine in 1974, right?
Oh my God, yeah.
The curbside shot, I'll call it, or the nightclub scenes down at Studio 54 in the 80s.
Yeah. Right. And I think he was probably raised while probably emotionally abandoned. At the same time, he was probably raised more like indulgent, you know, like he could do no wrong. Like
you don't think so?
Yeah, I think he probably was.
The epitome of self-centered, silver spoon fed.
And Cindy is saying he's a narcissist. By the way, that is the word that people use to describe the boomers when they were young. They were self-righteous narcissists prosecuting.
I still am.
You know,
you
still are a self-righteous narcissist.
I still am, and proud of it. It's what kept me alive.
I don't believe that. You don't appear to be narcissistic to me. But
towards society, I am in that sense. It's when you and I have seen what man is capable of, you become self-preserving, almost narcissistic in your ability to understand how truly evil people can be. In the same token, you develop a hardened character that is no nonsense, and most people that serve in the military get a no nonsense character, and a black and white world in which you live in, which is the narcissist world in a lot of ways. I'm not a narcissist, but you could describe me as that, based on my appearance, based on my mannerisms, based on my speech, based on my firm commitment to my beliefs, and I am the woman of the house. I never used to be, but I am now.
I was a single dad for 10 years, so I
Dude.
called myself the domestic sergeant major, actually. So I guess you could say I was the woman of the house. But at the same time, when I gave my daughter the knife hand and said mandatory fun is now in effect, she got her ass in the minivan. So that was and that we're the helicopter parents, Gen X. We're overprotective.
My first marriage was obviously in the early 80s, and my second marriage was in 92. And the co-parenting that we did during that time versus the single parenting that we did in my first marriage, who by 1985 and 1986, when I got separated as an RCR Master Corporal in battalion, I got full custody of my son. How the hell did that happen in 1986?
Well, great job. And you're highlighting another turning there, because it was right around that time. You see, during the second turning, little kids are depicted basically as little devils, So we saw like Rosemary's Baby, Children of the Corn, The Exorcist, and so on and so forth.
Crazy, man. Don't link this shit. It really disturbs me.
That's us. That's Gen X. We're the little devils, right?
That shit really disturbs me, man.
and then in the 80s, we saw a shift more towards revering children, like, Three Men and a Baby, Look Who's Talking Now, that kind of thing. So that's the millennial era. That's when we start raising children as protected, because Gen X came on the scene, and judges in the United States were like, we've just lost a generation, because we're all like the gangbangers and stuff like that. I mean, we fought twice as much. The boomers, statistically, they fought more than any other generation on record when they went to high school at that time. And then when Gen X got to high school, we fought twice as much and drank twice as much as any other generation on record.
The 80s were pretty brutal.
Oh man, it's wild to think. Like, I came back to Cape Breton because I'm nostalgic for going out in the woods with my friends, having a bonfire with some guitars and some girls, get drunk, take our shirts off, and punch each other. Like, that's what we did basically every weekend.
I'm surprised I'm still alive after the I'll call it debased behavior of the 1980s and early 1990s. I'm surprised I'm still alive.
Yeah. I hear you. There was a lot going on in the 80s, like the AIDS epidemic, and the serial killers coming on the scenes, like, holy smokes.
I think serial killers have always been around. They just weren't able to be broadcast as much. It's like bad shit has always happened in the last 100 years, and social media has made it instantaneous. Like, the whole world was awash with the lockdown at the Kempville High School today, because some kid on social media said he was going to shoot it up. So the whole friggin' police forces from 100 miles around came storming into Kempville, and it turned out to be nothing, as far as we know yet. But if some kid from down the road in the farm where I grew up outside of Brighton, Ontario, said, I'm going to go to school and shoot it up, he'd show up at the school and somebody would have slapped the gun out of his hand, kicked him in the ass, and sent him home,
You can't do that anymore because the state will intervene.
That's what's needed, though.
Yeah, I know. We got to put our foot in the kids' asses and stuff like that. I mean, I had to do that with my teenage son just to get him through school, but he did end up finishing Carleton with an honors degree. So, he's a little butthurt from having my foot in his ass, but he's got a good life now. Like, he's got a nice white collar job that he loves and all that stuff. So, I do think that, children require a firm hand. And unfortunately, the people who are running our institutions probably didn't get that when they were coming up.
I've often said to my kids, I said, you might not like me now, but if you love me at 25, I succeeded as a parent.
Yeah.
You want to hang out with me at 20, when you're 25, you succeeded as a parent, because those hard lessons have been gone through and they've got their own lives, and now they realize what you were telling them was true.
I think I'm in that boat of, my family was basically destroyed by COVID. So my kids don't actually talk to me. It's pretty sad, especially since we were a team for the single parent 10 years, the last 10 years of my career and stuff like that.
It will.
Eventually it will. Yeah. But, for now, I think I just kind of let those dogs lie, unfortunately. But it's something that I think.
And I'm sorry to hear that, Jess.
Yeah, it's okay. I've been dealing with it for a few years now. So
been through it, done it myself. So in this sense here with the extended family. Yeah, just don't even go there.
I know.
But I do have a question. Yeah, I'm going to end this at
Sure.
8:30 because my wife's going to bed. She's got to work in the morning. Or
I'm ready.
If in the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Are you allowed to speak about anything in regards to your court case?
I already have spoken about it. Just
I've tried finding stuff. I'm just letting you know I can't reveal anything, but we're going to a verdict on October 3rd. Now, I think it's the 14th or the 18th. They're doing another convoy run up here. I don't know if you've seen that floating about the internet.
The 16th. Yeah.
I think it's the 16th, but I just seen notice of it today. I've been inundated with spam since I started running in the election, and we've had a couple of DDNS attacks on our website. But hopefully on October 3rd, with the verdict, if it's what we expect it's going to be, it might be a game changer. So no guarantees about anything. You know how it works, right? Even though you might know something's happening, totally up to the judge. Yeah. So, but I would love to discuss 30 days after that verdict date, all the things that I went through in my 37 or whatever it is days for simple obstruct charge for driving.
Oh my God. Yeah. I'm in the same boat. We're expecting a decision with respect to the constitutional question that we have on the table on the 17th, and then we'll decide next steps from there. That's Tuesday. So, I have talked about what went on in the courtroom already. I haven't been told, like, there's no publication ban or anything like that. So, what I have said is basically, it's they're shifting the goalposts a little bit, and it turns out that they can't. I don't think they can't stand on the Emergency Measures Act. So it's hard to say that I was committing mischief at the time that I was arrested. But then they try using some footage from a drone from the day before when I was holding the line with the protesters, and it's not even clear what I did, what was mischief in that. So I think it's just like everybody is in this boat. So it's basically, to me, it seemed like they were really reaching with a lot of stuff. It's pretty trumped up.
Jeff, under the old charter and under the old Constitution and the old Bill of Rights, they never would have able to do this. And I remember when they rewrote the War Measures Acts to the Emergencies Act. And I remember specifically them saying that it cannot be used. Even Brian Peckford said that what they're using it for was not meant for this type of action, civil unrest. Unless it was civil unrest to a world-ending event, North America split in two, and they need to enact emergency act. At the end of the day, they only can do what they did because they have complete autonomy over our rights. You don't own property. You don't have property rights. In Texas, stand your ground laws, 41 states. In the U.S., if you find oil on your property, gold or silver, it's yours. There's no reserved rights like there is in Canada. There's never been pure property rights. Prior to the new Constitution and Charter, you had a right to defend your property, unlike the guy in Markham that woke up, the guy stabbed him in the head 5 times while he was sleeping, fought with the guy, tumbled out the door of the bedroom, got a knife in his hand, disarmed the attacker, and in his process of defending his life, ended up killing the guy, and he's serving 5 years in prison today for it.
Wrong.
Because the Crown said that when he disarmed the man, he should have backed away and called 911. This is the kind of, and when the state controls all that, communism owns the means of production, owns all ownership of everything, businesses, homes, property, land, then the state has to provide your defense. That's the great thing about the non-democracy that exists in the USA. It's a constitutional republic. It's not a democracy, and they're using word speak to think they have a democracy. Canada has a democracy. We used to have rights. We no longer have those rights, and as a result of that, there's no accountability to the people that can abuse them, and we are put through a judicial process of unfairness through what they call due process of proving your constitutional rights, which don't really guarantee anything, are actually work out in court. And that's the judicial part of it, is the punishment, even if you're proven not guilty at the end of it.
Yeah,
that's what they've allowed themselves to have, and that's what they've allowed themselves to do. I agree that thing.
major reforms are required and I believe forthcoming, because like I said, that's when we tear down institutions and rebuild them anew, is during
If
the
I'm
fourth
not
term.
alive
So.
and you're the leader, make sure you enshrine property rights in the new charter
Yo,
and the new.
I'm right there with you, bro. I'm all about the
because
free speech absolutism, property rights, self-defense rights,
when
stand your ground laws. Like
when you
I'm all
have
for it.
property rights, the state's authority ends at your doorstep without a warrant. Any state authority, and I say state meaning government, municipal, provincial, federal, can walk onto your property at any time. A police officer can't unless he suspects there's a crime and has visible evidence that he can see from the side of the road. But any municipal bylaw, provincial, federal, environment, whatever it is, can walk onto your property. Conservation officers have the right to demand you open your freezer so they can see how many fish you got in your freezer without a warrant. You have no property rights in Canada, and the premise of all rights are derived from property rights, and that's what we need to protect, because it'll stop them.
I do think that one of the silver linings in all of this has been that we've been shown just how weak our systems really are. You know, we can see where the weak points are. And so now we have an opportunity to shape the future for the better. And we should definitely avail ourselves of that opportunity. But Mark, we've been going for like 2:43, brother. I appreciate you being so generous with your time. I'm just going to plug the Veterans for Freedom website before we sign off. Subscribe to our newsletter here. Join if you're a veteran here, and support Veterans for Freedom here. Well, I think we're really just doing merch sales right now. This is probably going away with the donations. We're not doing the support fund anymore to help Canadians who are suffering under this tyranny. We've transitioned that over to the Accountability Project, and I have nothing but a white screen here on the Accountability Project tab for some reason. But what's it called? Tapcan.ca. So go check that out. It's a legal fund that we've set up to help Canadians sue, and it's helping Eddie Cornell and Vincent Kersey's sue right now. So Tapcan is the way to go. And that brings us back to our Hegel quote. He says, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history." No, the buck stops here, guys. The buck stops here. Let's make sure we learn from history on this one, and send those little bastards to war when they're coming of age, and make sure they get a Spartan upbringing when they're being reared. So that's it for me, Mark. Thanks again. I'm just going to throw to a couple.
I still believe you're hedging the word boomer wrong when it really comes to it's never about you versus the government. It's always about the state versus you. There is no left and right. There is no left and right. There's only the state versus you.
I see the state is really just, another one of the tools that we have for organizing our society. But broadly speaking, it's always been organized the same way, with elders leading institutions, midlifers leading people, and people doing the fighting and the working.
Crazy analogy. Yeah. I learned so much. I still disagree with your boomer analogy, because it all derives from the authority that they're granted to be able to do it.
What I take from it, though, when I look over, take the broad view of history, it's that the real revolution is generational, and it always has been. And even Freud talks about this with the totem feast in Totem and Taboo. Like, we used to eat them. We used to overthrow them and eat them. That's where the Last Supper comes from, actually, with the "eat this bread, for it is my body," and drink this wine, for it is my blood. Like, it's basically a metaphor that says you're agrarian now, so stop eating each other already. That's my take, and I know that I have a fairly unique way of looking at things. I'm not obviously putting everybody down in the boomer generation. We have some great ones. Eddie Cornell, I mentioned a few times, right? He's amazing, and Tom Quiggin is another great one with Veterans for Freedom. The Terrys are awesome. Like, we have all kinds of great ones. It's just that in terms of the institutional power, we don't have enough of them. We don't have enough Obi-Wans in the institutions.
Put it this way: if the 39% that don't vote for a different party, we would have a majority government across this province, across the country.
I'm going to run PPC.
There's enough committed. I don't want to get back into it, but there's enough committed, loyal voters that would change their vote if they seen something good, because they're sitting on the fence on the left or the right. And if we can convince the other 39% that don't show up and vote, that's a significant win.
Yeah. 1,000%. And I'm going with People's Party, and I'm the real liberal, and I'm taking my word back. I'm a classical liberal, which is just a real liberal. And,
classical liberal, if one came back from the 1900s and looked at a liberal today or a conservative, they'd shoot them because they had the right, liberals back then, to do that.
Yeah.
Because they believed in property rights.
Yeah, liberals are really right wingers. The whole paradigm is inverted. It's liberals on the left, and they're social democrats, right? Progressives.
Just remember, if you look at the last 40 years of politics, from Trudeau Sr., Mulroney, Chrétien, Harper, and I want you to think about this. You've been trained, all of you, maybe not you, maybe not the people that think PPC or other parties. You've been trained every 8 years to get mad at blue. Vote red.
I know.
And then the retraining begins to get mad at red and vote blue. And they control the message to make you mad at blue and then vote red. And then they control the message again to make you mad at red and vote blue. And they fall for it. And I'm not disparaging average Canadians, but that's how the propaganda works.
Oh, yeah. Well
ABC,
said.
Anything but conservative. Don't split the vote. Don't vote PPC because you're going to. Just imagine if the PPC or the Libertarians actually got a 20% showing. You know what happened overnight? Conservatism and liberalism would change their word speak to recapture that demographic.
Yeah.
But
the conservatives have lost their way, man. They're back to being the progressive conservatives. So we have a progressive uniparty.
They're state controlled.
I mean, progressive and social democrats.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
okay. I'm going to throw to a few comments here, brother. People, sounds like they really enjoyed the podcast here. Cindy is saying, I hope you come back in the show again, Mark. This has been a great show. And the short and long says there's no democracy in Canada. I think we know that. Cindy is saying the process is the punishment. Tracy is here saying, great show, guys. Have a great night. And Cindy one more time says, thanks, Jeff, as always. Hearts. Thanks, Mark. Great debate / discussion, you two. Victory. That's what that really means. Before the boomers co-opted that, the two fingers. Richard Nixon did it too. Serena is saying, interesting discussion. Thank you, Jeff and Mark. Yes, everyone must vote. Debbie says, great podcast and thank you. And I wanted to throw the Rumble guys here too, because I haven't been paying much attention to you. Honey, what is it? Canadian Honey Badger S over on Rumble there. I saw you commenting a bunch of times, and I'm just going to read one here. And she's saying, Jeff, I'm so sorry to hear you. I think she means my situation with my family. Yeah. Similar boat. If I could help you, I would. Thanks very much. I do appreciate the sentiment. I think it's just got to run its course, and it's a matter of time. But I do appreciate that. There's a lot of compassion out there and sympathy too. A lot of people are in this boat. So thanks for that. Okay, guys, that is it for us for tonight. Mark, thanks again for being so generous with your time, man. And you're welcome back anytime. I really appreciate it.
I grovel on my feet for being late, and I grovel to the mighty almighty Sergeant Major for not placing me in jail or giving me weekend battalion orderly sergeant duties.
Well, I am giving you 50 push-ups. So.
Oh God, no! My back.
Have a good night, sir. Yes, you too, and to everybody who stayed with us out there, stay frosty and stay safe out there.
Won't you help to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I